When a CEO woke up on a stranger's shoulder at 30,000 feet, she had no idea the exhausted single father beside her would soon be the only thing standing between 300 passengers and disaster. What happened next exposed a system that had failed him and nearly killed them all. This is the story of one emergency landing that changed everything. If you want to see how this impossible situation unfolds, stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The recycled air of Flight 447 hummed with the white noise of engines and muffled conversations as Avery Lawson finally allowed her eyes to close. She'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, back-to-back board meetings in New York, a crisis call with her legal team over coffee that had gone cold 3 times, and now this red-eye back to Seattle. Her assistant had booked her usual first-class seat, but a last-minute aircraft swap had shuffled everyone into a smaller plane with no premium cabin. So here she sat in 12B, wedged between a window that reflected her own exhausted face and a stranger whose shoulder had somehow become her pillow. She woke with a start, her neck stiff and her cheek pressed against worn denim that smelled faintly of engine oil and laundry detergent. For a mortifying moment, Avery didn't move. She simply processed the reality. She, the 42-year-old CEO of Meridian Aviation, one of the largest aerospace companies in North America, had fallen asleep on a complete stranger. She pulled back slowly, hoping to extract herself with some dignity and tact. The man beside her didn't stir. His eyes were open, fixed on the seat back ahead, but there was a stillness to him that suggested he'd been awake the entire flight. He had the build of someone who worked with his hands, broad shoulders, calloused fingers resting on the armrest between them, a faded jacket that had seen better years. His face was weathered, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of lines that come from squinting into sun and wind rather than age. Dark hair, slightly too long, tucked behind his ears, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Blue-gray, steady, and carrying something she recognized from her own reflection on the hardest days. The weight of someone who'd seen things they wished they hadn't. Tucked against his other side, head resting on the man's bicep, was a boy. 6, maybe 7 years old, with a mop of brown hair and cheeks still round with childhood. He wore a superhero t-shirt, Captain America, shield emblazoned across his small chest, and clutched a stuffed elephant that had lost most of its gray fur to love and time. His breathing was soft and even, utterly trusting. "I'm so sorry," Avery whispered, smoothing down her blazer and trying to reassemble herself into something resembling the competent executive she was supposed to be. "I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," the man said quietly, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the engine noise. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze forward. "You needed the sleep." There was no judgment in his tone, no irritation, just a simple statement of fact. Avery felt heat creep up her neck anyway. She wasn't used to being caught vulnerable. Still, that was unprofessional of me. "We're at 30,000 feet in a metal tube," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "I think professional went out the window somewhere over Cleveland." Despite herself, Avery smiled. She glanced at the boy again. "Your son?" "Yeah." The man's entire demeanor softened when he looked down at the sleeping child. "Ethan. He's had a long day." "Visiting family?" "Coming home. His grandmother's funeral was yesterday." The words were delivered without self-pity, just another fact. "She raised him while I was away. We're heading back to Seattle now, just the two of us. I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded once, accepting the condolence without elaboration. Avery settled back into her seat, pulling out her phone to check for messages. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks neither of them wanted. Outside the window, moonlight painted the clouds silver, an endless landscape of peaks and valleys that looked solid enough to walk on. She should have put her earbuds back in, returned to the quarterly reports waiting in her inbox. But something about the quiet man beside her, about the way he held his son with such careful attention even in sleep, made her curious in a way she rarely was about strangers. "Avery Lawson," she said, extending her hand across the armrest. He looked at her hand for a moment, as if deciding something, then took it. His grip was firm, his palm rough with old calluses. "Owen Parker." What do you do, Owen Parker? Mechanic. Small aircraft mostly. Some contract work at Boeing Field. He paused, then added, What about you? She could have given him the elevator pitch, CEO of Meridian Aviation, overseeing a fleet of commercial and cargo aircraft responsible for thousands of employees and millions in quarterly revenue. Instead, she said, I work in aviation too, management side. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer, and the conversation lapsed back into comfortable silence. Avery found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. There was something about the way he sat, alert despite his stillness, his body angled slightly to protect his son from the aisle traffic. His free hand, the one not holding Ethan, rested on his thigh, but his fingers moved occasionally in small, precise patterns. She recognized it after a moment. Control inputs, stick and rudder movements, the muscle memory of someone who'd flown before. You're a pilot, she said. It wasn't a question. Owen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Was. Long time ago. Military? A pause, longer this time. Air Force, transport and reconnaissance. Did 2 tours overseas. That explained the eyes, Avery thought, and the vigilance. Why'd you stop? Life happened. He shifted slightly, adjusting his arm around Ethan without waking him. Some things you can't go back to, even if you wanted to. There was a story there, one that clearly wasn't open for discussion. Avery respected that. She had her own chapters she didn't share with strangers on airplanes. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather ahead. The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. The plane gave a small shudder, nothing dramatic, just the normal bumps of hitting rougher air. But Avery noticed Owen's entire body tense. His hand that had been tracing phantom flight controls stilled completely. His eyes, which had been half-lidded with exhaustion, sharpened to full alertness. Just turbulence, she said, more to fill the silence than because he needed reassurance. She flew constantly. She knew the rhythms of flight. Right, Owen said, but he didn't relax. If anything, his focus intensified. She watched as his eyes tracked to the ceiling panels, to the emergency exit rows, counting distances. Assessing. His breathing had changed too, deeper, more controlled. The behavior of someone preparing for something. Another bump, harder this time. A few nervous laughs scattered through the cabin. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Ethan stirred slightly, making a small sound of confusion, and Owen's hand immediately went to the boy's head, soothing him back to sleep with practiced ease. Dad's here, buddy. Just a bumpy road. Go back to sleep. The boy settled, trusting completely. The turbulence increased. The plane began to buck and sway, not violently, but enough that conversations throughout the cabin died out. The woman across the aisle gripped her armrests, her knuckles white. A baby started crying somewhere toward the front. The overhead bins creaked with each impact. Avery had been through worse. She pulled out her tablet, determined to at least scan through the Harrison merger proposal before landing. But she found herself distracted by Owen's behavior. He hadn't reached for his phone or a magazine. He wasn't trying to distract himself or calm his nerves. He was reading the aircraft itself, the pitch of the engines, the angle of the wings outside the window, the subtle variations in the bumps and jolts. A particularly sharp drop made her stomach float. Several passengers gasped. Ethan woke up with a small cry of alarm. Dad? I've got you. Owen wrapped both arms around his son, pulling him close. Remember what we talked about? Airplanes are built strong. This is just like driving over a bumpy road. The pilot knows what she's doing. I don't like it. I know, but you're safe. I promise. Here. Owen shifted, angling himself so that Ethan couldn't see out the window, couldn't watch the wings flexing or the clouds rushing past. He pulled the worn elephant into the embrace. Mr. Trunks needs a brave kid to hold on to. Can you do that? Ethan nodded, burying his face in his father's chest and clutching the stuffed animal. Avery felt something catch in her throat. There was such tenderness there, such fierce protection. This was a man who'd been through something, carried something heavy, and had somehow not let it harden him where it mattered most. The plane lurched again, this time with a metallic groan that didn't sound routine. The lights flickered, just once, just for a second, but long enough to send a ripple of real fear through the cabin. The flight attendants, still in the aisles, grabbed for the nearest seats to steady themselves. One of them spoke urgently into the phone at her station. Owen's eyes had gone completely cold and focused. Professional. Avery recognized that look. She'd seen it on her test pilots, on her engineers during crisis simulations. It was the look of someone running calculations, preparing for scenarios, making decisions 3 steps ahead. "What is it?" she asked quietly, not wanting to alarm Ethan. "Could be nothing," Owen said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe that. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and Avery didn't like what she heard beneath the professional calm. The pilot's breathing was slightly off, the words coming in patterns that suggested stress management training kicking in. "Folks, we've hit some unexpected severe weather. We're going to be experiencing continued turbulence for the next 15 to 20 minutes while we navigate around this system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, take your seats." The plane dropped again, harder. This time, there were screams. Luggage shifted in the overhead bins with ominous thuds. A service cart that hadn't been properly secured broke loose somewhere behind them, crashing into seats. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in a cascade of yellow cups and clear tubes, swinging wildly with each jolt. "Put it on," someone shouted. Chaos erupted. People fumbled with the masks, some putting them on backward, others fighting with the tubes. Parents struggled to secure their children first. The cabin filled with the sound of rushing air and panicked voices. Owen moved with absolute precision. He pulled down 3 masks, tested each one with a quick tug, then placed one over Ethan's face, adjusting the strap with sure fingers. "Breathe normal, buddy. It's just a funny-looking hat. You're okay." Ethan's eyes were huge with fear, but he nodded, trusting his father even as the world came apart around them. Owen handed Avery her mask, waited to see her put it on correctly, then put on his own. All of it done in seconds, with the efficient calm of someone who'd trained for emergencies until they became reflex. The plane shuddered violently. The angle changed, nose tilting in a way that felt wrong. They were descending, but not in the controlled glide slope of a normal approach. This was faster, steeper. Avery's professional knowledge told her they were either trying to get below the worst of the weather or they were dealing with something more serious. Through the mask, Owen's voice was muffled but clear. "Check your seatbelt. Make sure it's tight across your lap. Secure anything loose." She did, her hands moving automatically even as her mind raced. This was her industry, her world, and she understood enough to be very afraid. But Owen's presence beside her, his absolute control, somehow anchored her. The teenage boy in the row ahead was crying, calling for his mother who was somewhere else on the plane. An elderly man across the aisle had his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. The baby's cries had become continuous, a heartbreaking soundtrack of pure terror. Another massive jolt. The plane seemed to fall out from under them for 3, 4, 5 seconds. Gravity disappeared. Avery's stomach launched into her throat. Someone vomited, the sharp smell cutting through even the rubber of the oxygen mask. Several people were sobbing now, the sound raw and uncontrolled. Ethan screamed, muffled through his mask, his small hands clutching his father's jacket with desperate strength. "Eyes on me, Ethan," Owen commanded, his voice cutting through the panic with the authority of someone used to being obeyed in crisis. "Look at me. Nowhere else. Just me." The boy locked onto his father's eyes. "Good man. Now breathe with me. In." Owen demonstrated, his chest rising. "Out." He exhaled slowly. "In. Out. That's it. You're doing great. You're the bravest kid on this whole plane." It was working. Ethan's breathing synchronized with Owen's, his panic ebbing even as the aircraft continued its violent dance with the storm. Avery found herself breathing with them too, letting Owen's steady rhythm ground her own rising fear. The intercom crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't the captain. It was a flight attendant, and her voice was barely controlled. "Is there anyone on board with flight experience? We have an emergency in the cockpit. Anyone with pilot training, please identify yourself immediately." The words hung in the cabin like a bomb that hadn't yet gone off. Avery's mind went blank with shock. An emergency in the cockpit, on a commercial flight. That meant what? Incapacitation? Medical emergency? The first officer should be able to handle it alone, should be trained for exactly this scenario, unless there was no first officer, or unless both pilots were compromised. She looked at Owen. He had gone absolutely still, every muscle locked in place. His face had drained of color beneath the tan. He stared straight ahead, his breathing rapid despite the measured rhythm he'd been teaching his son. "This is a general call for anyone with pilot training," the flight attendant repeated, her professionalism starting to crack. "If you have experience flying aircraft, please press your call button immediately." No one moved. 300 passengers, and not a single call button lit up. Avery's hand moved without conscious thought, reaching for Owen's arm. "You have to—" "No." The word came out flat, final, dead. "You heard her. They need— I can't." His voice was barely a whisper now, and in it Avery heard something that made her chest tighten. Not refusal. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. "I can't do that anymore." "Owen? Dad?" Ethan's small voice, confused and scared. "What's wrong?" The plane lurched again, and this time there was a grinding sound that made every engineer's instinct in Avery's body scream warnings. Something was wrong with the engines, or the hydraulics, or both. The flight attendant appeared in the aisle, nearly falling as she caught herself on the seats. She was young, maybe 25, and tears were streaming down her face even as she tried to maintain her composure. "Please," she called out, projecting her voice through the cabin. "We need help. Is anyone a pilot? Anyone?" Silence. Just the roar of wind and engines and fear. The attendant's eyes swept the cabin desperately and landed on their row, on Owen specifically. Something in his posture and the way he held himself must have registered because she stumbled toward them. "Sir? Do you have flight experience?" Owen's entire body was shaking now, subtle tremors running through his frame. Avery could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. His breathing had gone ragged. "He's a pilot," Avery said, making the decision for him. "Air Force. He can help." "No." Owen's hand shot out, gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles went white. "I can't. I'm sorry. I can't go back there. Find someone else." The flight attendant looked between them, confusion and desperation warring on her face. "Sir, please. The captain is unconscious. We think it's a heart attack. The first officer is trying to handle it alone, but she's never done a manual approach in conditions like this. The autopilot is malfunctioning. We're losing altitude faster than we should. We need—" A massive impact threw her sideways. She crashed into the seats across the aisle, crying out in pain. The plane was no longer just bucking. It was fighting, yawing hard to the left, engines screaming. "Dad!" Ethan was sobbing now, his small body racked with fear. "Dad, are we going to die?" And there it was, the question every parent dreads, delivered in the purest voice of childhood terror. Avery watched Owen's face as his son's words hit him, watched something break and reform in real time. The shaking stopped. The distant, paralyzed look in his eyes sharpened, his jaw set in a hard line. He closed his eyes for just a moment. His lips moved, saying something Avery couldn't hear. Then he opened them again, and the man who emerged was different, still terrified. She could see that in the tightness around his mouth, the rapid pulse in his neck, but present, decided. "Nobody," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "We're not going to die. Dad's going to make sure of it." He unclipped his seatbelt and Ethan's, pulling his son into a fierce embrace. He kissed the top of the boy's head, then turned to Avery. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "His name is Ethan Parker. He's 6 years old. His birthday is March 15th. He likes dinosaurs and he wants to be a paleontologist when he grows up. He's allergic to shellfish. His favorite book is about a mouse who wants to be a knight." Owen's eyes bored into hers with desperate intensity. "If I don't come back, if something happens, you make sure someone knows his story. You make sure someone knows he matters. Owen, promise me." Avery felt tears burning her eyes. "I promise. But you're coming back. You hear me? You're coming back to him." He didn't answer that. Instead, he turned to Ethan, cupping the boy's face in his hands. "Ethan, listen to me. I have to go help the pilots for a little while, but I need you to be brave. Can you be brave for me? I want to come with you. I know, buddy, but you need to stay here with Miss Avery. She's going to take care of you until I get back. You promise you'll come back? The plane dropped again, and somewhere toward the front, something major gave way with a sound like thunder. Smoke began to filter through the vents, acrid and wrong. Owen pulled his son close one more time. I love you more than anything in the whole world. You remember that, okay? No matter what happens, you remember that. I love you too, Daddy. Owen released his son and stood, swaying with the motion of the aircraft. The flight attendant who'd fallen was pulling herself up, bleeding from a cut above her eye. Owen offered her his hand, hauled her to her feet with surprising strength. Where's the cockpit? His voice had changed completely. Clipped, military, ready. This way. No, you need to secure the cabin. I'll find it. He looked back at Avery one more time, at Ethan now gripping the strange woman's hand with terrified trust. Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Then Owen Parker, the mechanic who'd been a pilot who'd walked away from flying, turned and made his way toward the front of the plane. He moved against the violent motion like someone who'd trained for it, using the seats for balance, his body automatically compensating for the aircraft's pitch and roll. Avery pulled Ethan onto her lap, wrapping her arms around him as she'd seen Owen do. The boy was rigid with fear, watching his father disappear toward the cockpit door. He's going to save us, isn't he? Ethan whispered. Avery looked at this small boy with his worn elephant and his superhero shirt, this child who'd just lost his grandmother and might lose so much more. She thought about Owen's hands moving through phantom flight controls, about the weight he carried in his eyes, about the way he'd overcome paralyzing fear because his son needed him to. Yes, she said, and chose to believe it. He's going to save us all. The plane shuddered again, diving steeper. Through the windows, Avery could see clouds racing past too fast, could feel the wrong angle of descent. They were running out of time, out of altitude, out of options. Somewhere ahead, beyond locked doors and emergency protocols, Owen Parker was facing the thing that terrified him most. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because 300 people were about to die, and one of them was his son. Avery held Ethan tighter and prayed to whatever forces governed the sky that the broken pilot would remember how to fly, because if he didn't, none of them would see the ground until it was too late. The cabin had become a nightmare of sound and motion. Warning bells chimed continuously from the cockpit, muffled but insistent. The engines roared at frequencies that kept changing, too high, then too low, then surging again in patterns that made Avery's engineering brain scream danger. The air itself seemed to vibrate with wrongness. Ethan buried his face in Avery's jacket, his small body shaking with sobs he was trying desperately to control. She could feel his heart hammering against her chest, a frantic bird rhythm that broke her own heart. Around them, the other passengers had passed through panic into something worse, a frozen, waiting terror. Some prayed audibly. Others sat in numb silence. The teenage boy who'd been crying for his mother had gone quiet, staring at nothing. The elderly man across the aisle held his wife's hand, both of them with eyes closed, ready for whatever came. Avery found herself cataloging details with the odd clarity that comes in crisis. The coffee stains on the tray table, the safety card sticking out of the seat pocket, its cheerful illustrations of emergency exits suddenly obscene in their inadequacy. The view out the window where darkness and clouds and occasional lights blurred together in a confusion that gave no sense of how close they were to the ground. Too close, her professional knowledge whispered. They were descending too fast, the angle too steep. Even if Owen got to the cockpit, even if he somehow took control, the physics might already be against them. Tell me about your dad, Avery heard herself say, her voice surprising her with its steadiness. She needed to keep Ethan focused, needed to keep herself from thinking about the 1,000 things that could go wrong. Ethan sniffled, lifting his head slightly. His cheeks were wet, his eyes red. What? Your dad. What's he like? What do you guys do together? We go to the park sometimes. He pushes me on the swings, really high. Higher than Grandma would ever let me go. A ghost of a smile. He says I'm going to be a rocket scientist, so I need to get used to being up high. Does he talk about when he used to fly? Ethan shook his head. Not really. Sometimes I find pictures in a box in the closet. Him in a uniform next to big planes. He looks different in them, younger, happy. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes at night, I hear him. He has bad dreams. He calls out names. Once I went in his room and he was crying. He said it was okay, that grown-ups get sad sometimes too. Avery's throat tightened. She thought about Owen's face when the flight attendant had asked for help, the way every ounce of color had drained from it. The absolute terror. This wasn't just a man who'd stopped flying. This was a man who'd been broken by it. And now she'd pushed him back toward the thing that had broken him. The plane banked hard right, throwing them against the window. The grinding sound came again, louder this time, and with it the smell of burning rubber, or maybe melting plastic. Someone screamed that they could see flames on the wing. Avery looked but couldn't make out anything definite through the darkness and rain that now streaked the windows. Miss Avery? Ethan's voice was very small. Do you think he can really do it? Save the plane? She wanted to lie, to give him comfortable assurances, but this child had just buried his grandmother. He'd lived with a father fighting invisible wounds. He deserved truth, even a 6-year-old's version of it. I think, Avery said carefully, that your dad is the bravest person on this plane. And I think he loves you more than he's afraid. That's a powerful combination. He promised he'd come back. Then he will. Avery made her voice firm, certain. He promised you. That means he will. She hoped she wasn't lying. Time fractured in the way it does during crisis. Seconds stretched into hours. Minutes collapsed into moments. Avery couldn't tell if Owen had been gone for 5 minutes or 20. The cabin lights flickered again, and this time when they came back they were dimmer, emergency lighting kicking in, battery power, which meant electrical systems were failing. The flight attendant who directed Owen to the cockpit had made her way back through the cabin, checking on passengers with a fixed professional smile that didn't reach her traumatized eyes. When she got to Avery's row, she crouched down, wincing at some injury. Your friend, she said quietly. He really is a pilot? Yes, Air Force transport, 2 tours. The woman closed her eyes briefly in what might have been relief or might have been prayer. Okay, that's good. We need... She paused as the plane lurched again. Sarah, the first officer, she's good, but she's 26 years old, and she's never dealt with anything like this. Captain Brennan, he's been flying for 30 years, but he's unconscious, and we can't wake him. Paramedics are waiting on the ground, but first we have to... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to say the words get there safely. What's actually wrong with the plane? Avery asked. She needed to know, needed to assess the scope of what Owen was facing. The attendant glanced at Ethan, clearly weighing what to say in front of the child. Multiple systems failures. Lightning strike took out most of the electronics. The weather's getting worse, not better. We're flying almost blind, and Seattle's completely fogged in. They're talking about diverting to Portland, but that's another 40 minutes, and I don't think... She stopped herself, but Avery understood. The attendant didn't think they had 40 minutes. The man who went forward, Avery said. Owen. He hasn't flown in years. He has trauma related to it. If there's any way to support him, any way to help, we gave him access to the cockpit. Sarah's on her own in there with him now. They've got ground control talking them through it. That's all we can do. The flight attendant's professionalism finally cracked completely, and tears spilled down her cheeks. That's all any of us can do. Just hope he remembers. Hope it's enough. She moved on to the next row, resuming her impossible task of keeping 300 people calm while they all felt the aircraft dying beneath them. Ethan had been listening to every word despite Avery's attempts to shield him. He looked up at her with those same blue-gray eyes that his father had, ancient beyond his years. Dad quit flying because his friend died. I heard Grandma talking about it once. She didn't know I was listening. Avery's heart sank. Ethan, his friend was flying with him, and something happened, and his friend didn't make it. Dad said he could never fly again because he'd see his friend's face every time. He said the sky wasn't his anymore. Ethan's grip on Mr. Trunks tightened until his knuckles were white. What if he sees his friend's face in the cockpit? What if he can't do it because he's too sad? What do you say to that? How do you explain to a child that trauma doesn't work on timers? That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it? Ethan, listen to me. Avery turned him to face her fully. Your dad went into that cockpit because you asked him a question. Remember? You asked if you were going to die. The boy nodded, tears tracking down his cheeks again. And your dad decided right then that the answer was no. That he would do whatever it took to keep you safe. Love like that, the kind your dad has for you, it's stronger than fear, stronger than sad memories, stronger than anything. She hoped she was right, prayed she was right. He's not just fighting for the plane, he's fighting for you, and that makes him unstoppable. Somewhere in the front of the plane, beyond walls and distance and the roar of dying engines, Owen Parker was fighting exactly that battle. Avery could picture it. His hands on controls he'd sworn never to touch again, his mind forcing itself through procedures and protocols while ghosts whispered in his ears. Every instinct probably screamed at him to run, to let someone else take this burden, but he couldn't run. Not anymore. His son was behind him, counting on him, trusting him with the absolute faith that only children possess. The intercom crackled again. This time it was a different voice, younger, female, trying desperately to sound confident. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Sarah Chen in the cockpit. We have assistance now, and we're working to get this aircraft down safely. We need you all to prepare for an emergency landing. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin. Emergency landing, the words every passenger dreads, delivered in a voice that was barely holding together. The cabin erupted in fresh panic. The flight attendants began shouting instructions. Brace positions, remove sharp objects, listen to commands. Parents clutched children, strangers held hands. The teenage boy was openly sobbing again. Someone was praying loudly in Spanish, the words tumbling over each other in desperate supplication. Avery pulled Ethan close, positioning him the way the safety card showed, protecting his head and neck. She found herself doing the same, assuming the brace position while her mind raced through everything she knew about aircraft crashes, survival statistics, the physics of impact. None of it was comforting. Miss Avery? Ethan's voice was muffled against his knees. Yes? If something bad happens, will you make sure Dad knows I wasn't scared at the end? I don't want him to think I was scared. She couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the boulder lodged in her throat, so she just held him tighter, this brave little boy with his worn elephant in his father's eyes. The plane dropped again, sickeningly fast. Avery's stomach rose into her chest. They were falling, really falling now. Gravity and weight and failed hydraulics all conspiring toward the inevitable. She could hear the structure groaning, could feel vibrations that suggested the aircraft was trying to tear itself apart. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a boardroom or an office or surrounded by achievements and accolades, but in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, holding a stranger's child, and hoping that a broken pilot could somehow perform one last miracle. Avery closed her eyes and thought of Owen's hands moving through phantom flight controls, thought of Ethan asking if they were going to die, thought of the promise she'd made to know Ethan's story, to make sure someone knew he mattered. Please, she thought. To whom, she didn't know. The universe. Fate. Whatever controlled the invisible forces that kept aircraft aloft or brought them down. Please let him remember. Please let him be enough. In the cockpit, Owen Parker was about to answer that prayer, or fail trying. The cockpit door had been designed to withstand forced entry, built to keep hijackers out and pilots safe inside their fortress of instruments and controls. Owen stood before it for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years, his hand raised to knock, his entire body screaming at him to turn around and run back to the relative safety of passenger ignorance. Behind this door lay everything he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. The smell of aviation fuel and fear sweat, the weight of lives depending on split-second decisions, the memory of his best friend's last words crackling through a headset before the world turned to fire and static. His hand was shaking so badly he had to steady it with the other one before he could manage to pound on the reinforced panel. 3 sharp raps, the emergency knock that flight crews would recognize. "Come in." A woman's voice, higher pitched than it should be, stress fracturing every syllable. "Hurry!" Owen forced his fingers to work the handle. The door swung inwards, and the cockpit hit him like a physical blow, a wall of sound and light and chaos that his brain instantly tried to process and catalog despite 5 years of practiced avoidance. Warning klaxons shrieked from multiple systems. The instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree designed by someone's nightmare, every gauge and indicator screaming different variations of emergency. The windscreen showed nothing but darkness and rain, the wipers working frantically and uselessly against the deluge. Lightning flickered somewhere to the left, briefly illuminating clouds that looked more like concrete walls than water vapor. The first officer, Sarah Chen, barely out of her 20s, her uniform still crisp despite the sweat darkening her collar, whipped her head around as Owen entered. Her eyes were wild with barely controlled panic, her hands moving constantly over controls that didn't seem to be responding the way they should. "You're the pilot?" she gasped. "Thank God! Thank God! Captain Brennan had a heart attack about 8 minutes ago. I got him out of the seat, but I can't." Her voice hitched. "The autopilot's completely dead. Lightning fried the main computer and the backup cycling errors. I'm hand-flying, but the hydraulics are compromised and we're losing altitude faster than I can compensate, and I can't see anything, and—" "Stop." Owen's voice came out harder than he intended, the command voice from a lifetime ago when he'd been someone different, someone whole. "I need you to breathe and give me a sit-rep, clear and concise. Can you do that?" Sarah gulped air, nodded, her training fighting its way through terror. Okay. Boeing 737-800, approximately 23 minutes out from Seattle-Tacoma, current altitude 11,000 feet and descending at 800 feet per minute. Multiple systems failures, autopilot down, primary flight computer down, backup cycling errors. Hydraulics at 60% and dropping. Both engines running, but number 2 is throwing temperature warnings. Weather below minimums. Seattle's reporting 400 feet ceiling, quarter-mile visibility, and heavy rain and fog. They're recommending we divert to Portland, but I don't think we have time. Owen felt his body moving before his mind had fully processed the decision. He slid into the captain's seat, still warm from its previous occupant, a coffee cup still in the holder showing a half-drunk latte, and his hands found the controls with the terrible familiarity of muscle memory. The yoke felt exactly as he remembered. The throttle quadrant, the rudder pedals, the hundreds of switches and buttons and levers that made up the symphony of flight. His fingers knew them all, remembered them all, even as his mind screamed that he shouldn't be here, couldn't be here. "Talk to me about the engines," he said, his eyes scanning the instruments, forcing his brain to process what it was seeing instead of what it was remembering. Airspeed, 220 knots, too fast for this altitude and configuration. Vertical speed, -850, that number climbing. Artificial horizon showing a 3-degree left bank and a nose-down attitude that was increasing. Fuel state, adequate but not generous, and everywhere, warning lights. "Number 2's running hot," Sarah said, pointing to the engine indicators with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. "Started about 5 minutes ago. Temperature's in the caution range but climbing. Number 1's okay, but it keeps trying to surge. RPM fluctuates every 30 seconds or so." Electrical systems? "Battery backup only. We lost both generators when the lightning hit. Battery's showing 70%, but it's draining fast with all these warnings." Owen's hands moved across the panel, silencing the most urgent alarms to clear the auditory clutter. The klaxons died one by one until he could hear the actual sounds of the aircraft. The rush of wind, the roar of stressed engines, the groan of the airframe fighting forces it wasn't designed to handle for extended periods. "What's your flight time?" he asked Sarah, not taking his eyes off the instruments. 1,800 hours. 6 months on the 737. "Ever done a manual approach in weather like this?" "Simulator only, twice." "Category 3 ILS experience?" "No, we haven't. The airline hasn't certified me for that yet." "Of course not. Why would they? Commercial aviation was so automated these days that pilots could go entire careers without hand-flying an approach in actual instrument conditions. The computers did it all, safe and precise and reliable. Until they didn't. Owen reached for the radio, his hand steady now that he had something concrete to do, a problem to solve that existed in the present instead of the past. "Seattle approach, This is Northwest 447. How do you read? Static, then a male voice, professionally calm despite the circumstances they all knew existed. Northwest 447, Seattle approach reads you 5 by 5. We have your transponder. Confirm you have a qualified pilot at the controls? Affirmative. Former Air Force, 1,500 hours in C-130s, rated but not current on commercial. Going to need all the help you can give us. A pause. Owen could almost hear the controller recalculating options, probabilities, survival chances. Copy that, 447. Respect the service. We're going to get you down safe. Stand by for vectors. The aircraft lurched hard right, throwing Owen against his harness. Sarah cried out, fighting her own controls. Number 2 engine's temperature gauge spiked into the red zone, and a new alarm joined the symphony, a grinding metallic shriek that meant something in the turbine section was coming apart. "We're losing number 2, Sarah shouted. Owen's hand was already moving, reaching for the fuel cutoff, the fire suppression, executing the engine failure checklist from memory, even as part of his brain screamed that this was exactly how it had started before. The last time, when Jake had been in the right seat instead of this terrified young woman, and the sky had been full of tracer fire instead of rain, but the feeling was the same, that sickening certainty that the aircraft was dying beneath them and taking them with it. "Number 2 engine secured," he reported, his voice mechanical. "Fire suppression activated. Confirm no fire lights." "No fire," Sarah confirmed, her voice shaking. "But we just lost 20% of our thrust." "Increase number 1 to maximum continuous thrust. We'll need everything it's got." The remaining engine wound up, its roar deepening as Sarah advanced the throttle. The aircraft shuddered in response, the asymmetric thrust trying to yaw them left. Owen compensated with rudder, his feet working the pedals in tiny corrections, feeling through the controls what the instruments were telling him. They were heavy, sluggish. The hydraulics were definitely degrading. "Seattle approach 447 has lost number 2 engine. Single engine approach required. We need the straightest, longest runway you've got and emergency equipment standing by." "Copy, 447. Radar shows you at 10,200 feet, 12 miles northeast of the field." Weather at the airport is now 300-foot ceiling, 1/8 mile visibility, heavy rain. Runway 16 left, ILS available. Be advised, winds are 220 at 18, gusting to 28. That's going to put you in a significant crosswind on final. Owen did the mental math automatically. 28 knots of crosswind at the far edge of the aircraft's landing limits, probably beyond them given their degraded state. In weather that was barely legal for a fully functional aircraft with 2 experienced pilots, on one engine with hydraulics failing and no automation to help them. He looked at Sarah. She'd heard all of it, understood all of it. The fear in her eyes had evolved into something else, not calm exactly, but a kind of desperate focus. She was young, but she was professional, and she was still here, still fighting. "We're going to need to work together on this," Owen said. "I'll fly the aircraft. You manage the systems and back me up on the approach. Call out altitudes, airspeeds, anything that looks wrong. You see me doing something that doesn't make sense, you say so immediately. This isn't military. This isn't a hierarchy. This is just 2 pilots trying to keep people alive. Understood?" Sarah nodded. "Understood. Good. Now tell me about the hydraulics. What do we actually have?" She checked the panel, her hands moving with more confidence now that someone was sharing the burden. "System A is at 40% and dropping. System B is at 70. Backup is holding at 80 for now. Flight control's still responding, but there's significant lag. Rudder authority is reduced by about half. Flaps? I can get you probably 25 degrees, maybe 30 if we're lucky. Anything more, and I think we'll damage the system completely." 25 degrees of flaps when they needed 40 for a normal landing, which meant higher approach speed, which meant more runway needed, which meant less margin for error. Owen felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the beginning of the panic that had lived inside him since the day Jake died, since the day he'd watched his best friend's aircraft turn into a fireball while his own hands fought uselessly with controls that wouldn't respond. Not now. He couldn't do this now. Ethan was back there, trusting him. 300 people were back there, none of them deserving to die because of his demons. 447, Seattle approach. Descend and maintain 6,000 feet. Turn left heading 140. That'll put you on a long downwind for runway 16 left. Descending to 6,000, turning 140, Owen repeated, his hands already moving to comply. The yoke felt like it was connected to the control surfaces through taffy instead of hydraulics. Everything was mushy, delayed. He had to lead his inputs, anticipate what the aircraft would do seconds before it did it. They broke through a cloud layer at 9,000 feet, and for a moment Owen could see lights below, the sprawl of Seattle, the gridwork of streets and the glow of buildings, all of it partially obscured by the storm. Somewhere down there was SeaTac Airport, miles of concrete and approach lights and emergency vehicles waiting to see if they'd arrive as a landing or a crash. The aircraft shook violently, hit by another wind shear. Sarah gasped as her head cracked against the side window. Blood trickled from her temple, but she waved off Owen's concern. I'm fine. Northwest 447, be advised. We're getting reports of severe turbulence below 5,000 feet. Multiple aircraft are going around. Wind shear alerts active on all runways. Perfect. As if this wasn't hard enough already. Owen's right hand, the one not on the yoke, had curled into a fist so tight his fingernails were cutting into his palm. He forced it open, forced his breathing to slow. He'd trained for this, done countless approaches in conditions that made this look like a sunny afternoon. The C-130 was a different beast than the 737, but the principles were the same. Airspeed, altitude, configuration. Fly the aircraft. Trust your instruments. Don't let fear make your decisions. Except last time he'd done all of that, and Jake had still died. How long since you've flown? Sarah asked suddenly, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. 5 years, give or take. But you remember how? Owen thought about that. Did he remember? Or was muscle memory just another word for haunting, his body repeating patterns his mind had tried desperately to erase? I guess we're about to find out. They descended through 6,000 feet, the aircraft bucking and heaving in the turbulent air. Seattle approach vectored them through a series of turns, extending their pattern to give them more time to prepare, more distance to lose altitude gradually, rather than in a steep dive that would stress the already damaged hydraulics. 447, you're 8 miles from the outer marker. Turn left heading 160. Cleared for ILS runway 16 left approach. Contact tower on 118.3. Cleared for the approach, switching to tower, Owen acknowledged. He looked at Sarah. Call out the landing checklist. We're doing this by the book. Sarah's voice steadied as she fell back on procedure, on the ritual of the challenge and response that had been drilled into her through hundreds of hours of training. Landing gear. Down. Owen reached for the gear lever, felt it drop with a satisfying thunk. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. 3 green, gear down, and locked. Flaps. 25. That's all we're taking. He moved the flap lever carefully, watching the indicator as the trailing edge surfaces extended. The aircraft's nose pitched down slightly, requiring back pressure on the yoke to maintain altitude. More mushiness. The hydraulics were getting worse. Engine start switches. Ground idle on number 1, off on number 2. They worked through the entire checklist, each item a small anchor of normalcy in the chaos. When they finished, Owen felt fractionally more in control. Not confident, he'd probably never feel confident in a cockpit again, but functional, capable of doing what needed to be done. Northwest 447, tower, wind 230 at 22, gusting 3-2. Runway 16 left cleared to land. Emergency equipment is standing by. Cleared to land 16 left, Owen replied. 5 miles out. The ILS needles appeared on the display, showing them high and right of the approach path. Owen worked the yoke and rudder, feeling his way toward the invisible line in space that would lead them to the runway. The wind fought him every inch, trying to push them east, then suddenly reversing and shoving them west. Nothing was stable. Nothing was predictable. 4 miles, Sarah called out. Airspeed 165. Too fast. Owen pulled back power on the single remaining engine, felt the aircraft slow with painful reluctance. 160. 155. There. That was better. Slow enough to be controllable, but fast enough to maintain lift and give them options if they had to go around. Except they couldn't go around. Not really. With one engine and failing hydraulics and electrical systems running on battery backup that wouldn't last another 30 minutes, this was their one chance. They either made this landing or they didn't. There was no retry. 3 miles, localizer captured, glide slope captured. Owen let himself follow the needles, trusting the ground-based instruments to guide them through the murk. The windscreen showed nothing but rain and darkness. They were flying blind, completely dependent on electronics that had already proven themselves unreliable tonight. 2,000 feet above field elevation, Sarah announced. Sink rate 800 feet per minute. Too high. Owen added a touch of power, felt the sink rate decrease to 600. Better. The yoke felt heavier now, requiring constant pressure to maintain attitude. His arms were starting to ache from fighting the controls. Minimums in 300 feet, Sarah said, her voice tight. That was the decision point. If they couldn't see the runway at minimums, at 200 feet above the ground, they were supposed to execute a missed approach, climb away, try again or divert somewhere else. But Owen knew they didn't have the fuel or the systems for another attempt. This was it. 2 miles, sink rate 700, lightning struck somewhere close, the flash turning the clouds bright white for an instant. Thunder rolled through the airframe like a physical wave. The artificial horizon tumbled briefly, the instrument losing its mind for 3 seconds before recovering. Unreliable. Everything was unreliable. Approaching minimums. 1,000 feet above field elevation. Owen's eyes flicked between the instruments and the windscreen. Still nothing visible outside but water and darkness. Where was the runway? Where were the approach lights that should be cutting through this soup, showing them the way home? Minimums. 500 feet. I've got nothing, Sarah said, her voice cracking. I can't see anything. Keep calling altitudes. Owen's own voice sounded far away, mechanical. He was flying on instruments alone now, trusting needles and numbers and electronics that had already failed them once tonight. The glide slope needle showed them slightly high. He lowered the nose a fraction, added forward pressure. 400 feet. The wind hit them from the left, a massive shear that threw them 20 degrees off course. Owen stomped right rudder, cranked the yoke, fighting to recapture the center line. The aircraft wallowed, reluctant, the damaged hydraulics making every input feel like pushing through mud. 300 feet! There, a glow in the darkness ahead. Red lights, barely visible through the rain. The Poppy Eye system, the precision approach path indicator that would tell them if they were too high or too low. Owen's trained eye read it instantly. Too red, too white. Perfect glide path. I've got the approach lights, Sarah shouted. 11 o'clock. Owen saw them a second later, a string of brilliant white lights cutting through the storm, leading them toward the threshold. And beyond them, finally, the runway. Parallel lines of white light stretching into the distance, the most beautiful sight he'd seen in 5 years. 200 feet, sink rate 800. Too high again. Owen pulled more power, felt the aircraft float, the runway rising to meet them slower than it should. But he couldn't force it down, couldn't risk hitting hard with the damaged gear and hydraulics. They'd break apart on impact. 100 feet, runway in sight. They crossed the threshold at 70 feet, still too high, the runway lights flashing beneath them. Owen held the nose up, bleeding off airspeed, waiting for the aircraft to settle. 50 feet. The wind caught them again, a vicious crosswind from the right that threatened to blow them off the center line. Owen corrected, but the hydraulics were so degraded now that the rudder barely responded. They were drifting, the aircraft crabbed into the wind, not aligned with the runway. 30 feet! We're off centerline, Sarah warned. I know! Owen fought the controls, feeling the aircraft on the edge of his ability to manage it. The crosswind was too strong, the rudder too weak. They were going to land in a crab, sideways, the gear not designed for the side loads it was about to experience. 20 feet! No choice now, no time for finesse or grace. Owen chopped the remaining power to idle and pulled back hard on the yoke, forcing the nose up into a landing flare. The aircraft hung there for an eternal moment, suspended between sky and earth, between success and catastrophe. Then they hit. The main gear touched first, but the angle was wrong, the aircraft still in a crab. The tires screamed against the concrete, smoking. The gear struts compressed, but the side load was too much. Owen heard something snap, a sound like a gunshot, and the right main gear collapsed. The aircraft dropped onto its right wing with a shriek of tearing metal. Sparks exploded into the darkness as the wing scraped along the runway. They were spinning now, the remaining gear trying to pivot them, the collapsed gear acting as an anchor. Sarah screamed. Alarms shrieked. The world outside the windscreen became a blur of lights and rain and concrete. Owen stood on the left rudder, fighting to keep them from flipping completely. The nose gear was still down, still intact. If he could keep weight on it, if he could keep them tracking somewhat straight, they slewed sideways, still moving at 70, 60, 50 knots. The wing was disintegrating, pieces of metal and composites tearing away in a shower of sparks. Fuel was leaking. Owen could smell it, could see it streaming from the ruptured tank. One spark in the wrong place, and they'd all be... The aircraft finally stopped. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Owen's hands were still locked on the controls, his entire body rigid with adrenaline. Sarah was gasping for air beside him, her hands covering her face. Outside, the emergency vehicles were already converging, their lights painting the rain in shades of red and white and blue. "We're down," Owen heard himself say. "We're down and we're alive." Then he heard the screams from the cabin behind them, and he remembered that his job wasn't finished yet. Owen's hands were still locked on the yoke when Sarah grabbed his shoulder, shaking him hard enough to break through the shock that had frozen him in place. "We have to evacuate," she shouted, already unstrapping from her harness. "The fuel, if it ignites." The smell hit him then, sharp and chemical. Aviation fuel pooling beneath the shattered wing and streaming across the rain-slicked runway. Through the cockpit windows, he could see firefighters in silver suits spraying foam, creating a barrier between the aircraft and the dozens of hot metal surfaces that could turn leaked fuel into an inferno. They had minutes at best, maybe seconds. Owen's training kicked in, overriding the paralysis. He yanked off his oxygen mask and harness, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and spun toward the cockpit door. Behind it, he could hear chaos, screams and shouts, and the grinding sound of flight attendants forcing open emergency exits. Somewhere in that pandemonium was Ethan, and the thought of his son sent a spike of pure terror through Owen's chest that dwarfed anything he'd felt during the landing. He burst through the cockpit door into a scene from a nightmare. The cabin was tilted at a 15-degree angle, sloping down toward the collapsed right side. Oxygen masks hung like yellow jellyfish, swaying with the aircraft settling. The overhead bins had burst open on impact, spilling luggage and belongings into the aisles. A woman in row 3 was bleeding from a head wound, slumped against the window. The teenage boy who'd been crying earlier was now helping an elderly passenger toward the front exit, his face set in grim determination. People were climbing over seats, pushing, shoving, the primal instinct for survival overriding everything else. "Ethan!" Owen's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Ethan!" "Dad!" The sound of his son's voice oriented Owen like a compass finding north. He saw them 3/4 of the way back. Ethan still in Avery's arms, the CEO's face pale but composed as she worked to unbuckle them both from their seats. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were methodical, efficient. Owen fought his way down the slanted aisle, using the seatbacks for balance, his mechanic's eye automatically cataloging damage as he moved. The fuselage was intact, no breaches in the pressure hull, but the right side of the cabin showed stress fractures in the wall panels. The aircraft had taken a beating, but she'd held together. She'd protected her passengers one last time. He reached row 12 just as Avery got them both free. Ethan launched himself at Owen with such force that they both nearly went down, but Owen caught him, held him, felt his son's heart hammering against his chest like a trapped bird. "I've got you, buddy. I've got you." Owen's voice cracked on the words. He buried his face in Ethan's hair for just a moment, breathing in the smell of him, feeling the solid reality of his son alive and whole and safe in his arms. "You did so good. You were so brave." "I wasn't scared," Ethan said, but his voice was muffled against Owen's shoulder and his small body was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "I knew you'd save us. I told Miss Avery you would." Owen looked at Avery over his son's head. She was climbing out of the row, already helping the elderly man in the seat across get to his feet. Blood streaked down her temple from where she'd hit something during the impact. but her eyes were clear and focused. "We need to move," she said, her CEO voice emerging despite the circumstances. "That fuel? I know, come on." Owen shifted Ethan to his hip the way he used to when the boy was smaller, one arm locked around him, the other hand free to help people as they moved toward the exits. "Stay with me, both of you." They joined the flow of passengers heading forward. The flight attendants were at the exits, managing the evacuation with impressive calm despite the circumstances. The forward left door was open, the emergency slide deployed and angled steeply down to the foam-covered runway. People were jumping onto it, some sliding smoothly, others tumbling awkwardly, but all of them getting away from the aircraft and the fuel and the fire that could consume them all. "You first," Owen said to Avery when they reached the door, "then I'll hand Ethan down to you." She didn't argue, just nodded and sat at the edge of the door sill. The flight attendant stationed there, the same young woman who'd found Owen in his seat, her uniform torn and her face streaked with soot, helped position her properly. "Arms crossed over your chest, feet together, lean back and push off," the attendant instructed with mechanical precision, probably the 100th time she'd said it in the last 2 minutes. Avery slid down and disappeared into the darkness and rain. Owen watched her land at the bottom, watched her scramble to her feet, and turned back to look up at them. "Okay, Ethan." Owen set his son down, crouching to his level. "Remember the safety video? Arms crossed, hold on tight. Miss Avery's going to catch you at the bottom." "Come with me!" Ethan's eyes were huge, terrified at the thought of separation. "I'm right behind you, I promise. 5 seconds after you go, I'm coming down. But I need to make sure you're safe first. Can you do this?" Ethan nodded, though his chin was trembling. Owen lifted him to the sill, positioned his small arms across his chest, and looked into his son's eyes one more time. "Brave, remember? You're the bravest kid on this whole plane." Then he pushed, gently, and Ethan slid down the chute with a small cry that was half fear and half exhilaration. Owen watched until he saw Avery catch the boy at the bottom, saw them both move away from the slide toward the emergency vehicles, and only then did he turn to help the next passenger. "Sir, you need to go," the flight attendant said. "You've done enough, please. Not until everyone else is out." Owen was already reaching for an older woman who was frozen in her seat 3 rows back, paralyzed by fear or shock. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me. We need to leave now." He worked his way back through the cabin, helping those who couldn't help themselves, carrying a child whose mother had been injured, supporting a man whose leg had been broken in the impact. The flight attendants were doing the same, their training overriding their own fear, their own exhaustion. Sarah appeared from the cockpit carrying the first aid kit, moving to help the woman with the head wound. Minutes passed like hours. The cabin slowly emptied. The smell of fuel grew stronger, mixing with smoke that was starting to filter in from somewhere aft. The firefighters outside were shouting warnings that Owen couldn't quite make out over the wind and rain and the ringing in his ears that might have been tinnitus or might have been the echo of warning klaxons. "That's everyone!" one of the flight attendants called from the rear. "Cabin's clear!" Owen did one more sweep with his eyes, checking every row, every seat. Empty. All of them empty. 300 passengers and crew, and somehow they'd gotten them all out alive. "Go!" he shouted to the remaining flight attendants. "Get out!" They went, sliding down the chutes or jumping from the overwing exits, their training exhausted and their reserves spent. Sarah was the last one at the forward door besides Owen. She paused at the threshold, looking back at him. "Thank you," she said, and there were tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "I couldn't have done this without you. I would have killed everyone on this plane if you hadn't—" "You would have figured it out," Owen interrupted, surprised to find he meant it. "You're a good pilot, Sarah. You kept your head when it mattered. That's what counts." She nodded, not quite believing him, but accepting the words anyway, and slid down into the night. Owen took one last look at the cabin, this metal tube that had nearly become a coffin, that had instead become a testament to engineering and luck, and maybe something else he didn't have words for. And then he sat at the edge of the door sill and pushed off. The slide was slick with rain, and he came down faster than he expected, landing hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Hands grabbed him immediately, Firefighters in their silver suits pulling him away from the aircraft, away from the danger zone, toward the waiting ambulances and fire trucks with their flashing lights. "Ethan!" Owen's voice was hoarse, ragged. "Where's my son? Dad!" And there he was, breaking away from Avery's grip and running across the foam-slicked concrete with complete disregard for the emergency personnel trying to manage the chaos. Owen dropped to his knees and caught his son, held him so tight that Ethan squeaked in protest. And then Owen was crying, really crying, tears and rain mixing on his face while his body shook with the release of 5 years of grief and fear and the terrible weight of responsibility that had just lifted from his shoulders. "You did it," Ethan was saying, his small hands patting Owen's face. "You saved everyone. You're a hero, Dad." Owen couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to the moment. So he just held his son and let himself feel everything he'd been suppressing since the moment he'd stood up in that cabin and walked toward the cockpit. The terror, the doubt, the absolute certainty that he was going to fail, that his past would destroy his present, that he'd lose everything that mattered. But he hadn't. Somehow, impossibly, he hadn't. Avery appeared beside them, accompanied by a paramedic with a medical kit. "We need to check you both over," she said gently. "Make sure you're not hurt." Owen let them lead him to one of the ambulances, let them shine lights in his eyes, and check his vitals while Ethan sat on his lap and refused to let go. Around them, the evacuation site was controlled chaos. Passengers wrapped in emergency blankets, medics triaging injuries, firefighters still spraying foam on the aircraft where smoke now poured from the wing root. News helicopters circled overhead despite the weather, their searchlights cutting through the rain. The paramedic examining Owen shook her head in amazement. 312 people on that plane, she said. And from what we're seeing so far, nothing worse than broken bones and some lacerations. No fatalities. That's a miracle. "That's a pilot who knew what he was doing," Avery corrected, and there was steel in her voice. "That's training and skill and courage." Owen shook his head. "That's luck. That's a good first officer and an aircraft that held together longer than it should have, and a runway that was just barely long enough. He stopped, swallowed hard. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Sarah said, appearing out of the crowd with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a bandage on her temple. "You did what most people couldn't do. What I couldn't do alone." She sat down heavily on the ambulance bumper beside them. "I froze up there. When the captain went down, when the systems failed, I froze. I had the training, but I didn't have—" She gestured helplessly. "Whatever you have. That thing that lets you function when everything's falling apart." "You didn't freeze," Owen said firmly. "You kept that aircraft in the air until I got there. You managed the systems. You called out the approaches. We were a crew up there, Sarah. You did just fine." An official-looking man in an FAA jacket approached, flanked by 2 others with notebooks and cameras. "I'm going to need statements from both pilots," he said without preamble. "And we'll need to examine the wreckage once it's safe." "Later," Avery said, stepping between the officials and Owen with the command presence of someone used to being obeyed. "You can have your statements later. Right now these people need medical attention and rest. Ma'am, this is an active investigation, and it will still be active in the morning." Avery pulled out her phone, damaged but still functional, and tapped the screen. "I'm Avery Lawson, CEO of Meridian Aviation. This is one of our aircraft. You'll have full cooperation from my company, but you will not harass survivors in the immediate aftermath of a crash. Is that clear?" The FAA official blinked, taken aback by her tone. "Ms. Lawson, I didn't realize—" "Now you do. These people saved 300 lives tonight. They deserve a few hours of peace before the bureaucracy descends, don't you think?" The man hesitated, then nodded curtly. "We'll need everyone to stay in the Seattle area for the next 72 hours minimum, and we'll want detailed statements as soon as possible." "You'll get them." Avery's expression softened slightly. "I understand you have a job to do. Just let us breathe first." They moved away, already conferring among themselves, and Avery turned back to Owen and Ethan. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? Family in the area?" Owen shook his head. "We were heading home from my mother's funeral. Home was here in Seattle, but we live in a studio apartment near Boeing Field. Not exactly set up for company." Then you're coming with me. It wasn't a question. I have a house in Madison Park, 4 bedrooms, all of them empty. You both need food and sleep and probably a hot shower. I'm not taking no for an answer. Owen wanted to protest, to maintain some dignity, some independence. But the truth was he was exhausted beyond measure, his body running on fumes and adrenaline crash, and Ethan was already half asleep against his chest despite everything that had happened. He didn't have the strength to argue. "Thank you," he said simply. Avery arranged everything with the efficiency of someone who spent her life solving logistics problems. A car appeared within 15 minutes, a town car with a driver who didn't bat an eye at their disheveled appearance or the fact that they smelled like jet fuel and fear sweat. They drove through rain-slicked streets while Ethan slept between them, his head on Owen's shoulder and his hand clutching Mr. Trunks. Avery's house was exactly what Owen would have expected from a CEO. Modern, expensive, all-clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark waters of Lake Washington. But it also felt lived in, comfortable. There were books scattered on the coffee table, a blanket thrown over the back of the couch, photos on the walls of Avery with people who must be family or friends. "Guest room is upstairs, second door on the right," Avery said, flipping on lights as they entered. "Bathroom attached. I'll find some clothes you can change into. Not sure what I have that'll fit, but anything's better than what you're wearing." Owen carried Ethan upstairs and laid him on the bed. His son didn't wake, didn't stir, exhausted beyond consciousness. Owen pulled off the boy's shoes gently, covered him with the blanket, and stood there for a long moment just watching him breathe, the rise and fall of his small chest, the slight flutter of his eyelids that suggested dreams, the absolute trust in his sleeping face. A knock at the door. Avery stood in the hallway holding sweatpants and a t-shirt. "These might work. They were my brother's. He's about your size." "Was?" "Is," Avery corrected with a slight smile. "Sorry, bad phrasing. He lives in Boston now. Different life, different coast. We don't see each other much." Owen took the clothes. "Thank you for all of this. You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." Avery's expression was serious now. "You saved my life tonight. You saved all our lives. The least I can do is offer you a bed and a meal." She left him to change. Owen stripped off his fuel-soaked clothes, standing there in the attached bathroom and catching sight of himself in the mirror. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 3 hours. There were new lines around his eyes, new gray in his stubble. His hands, when he held them up, were still trembling slightly. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd gone back into a cockpit, faced the thing that terrified him most, and he'd brought them home. Not perfectly. The aircraft was destroyed. People were injured, but alive. Everyone alive. Jake would have been proud. The thought came unbidden and brought fresh tears that Owen didn't try to stop. His best friend, his wingman, the brother he'd chosen who died because Owen hadn't been fast enough, smart enough, good enough to save him. Jake would have laughed at tonight's landing, would have made jokes about scraping the wing and blown gear, would have bought Owen a beer and told him he'd done okay. Owen showered quickly, letting the hot water wash away the smell of fuel and the stickiness of dried sweat. When he came back out, Ethan was still sleeping peacefully. Owen sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on his son's back, feeling the steady rhythm of breathing that meant safe, alive, here. Voices drifted up from downstairs. Avery was on the phone, her tone professional despite the late hour. Owen caught fragments. "Yes, all crew accounted for. Structural failure of the right main gear. I'll have a full report by morning." "No, thank you, I'm fine." He found her in the kitchen when he came down, phone finally put away, standing at the counter making tea. She'd changed too, into jeans and a sweater, and without the power suit and the CEO armor, she looked younger, more vulnerable. The cut on her temple had been cleaned and covered with a small bandage. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked without turning around. "Haven't tried yet, too wired." Owen accepted the mug she offered him, wrapping his hands around it for warmth he didn't really need. "Your people know about the crash?" "The whole world knows by now. It's all over the news. Dramatic emergency landing at SeaTac, passengers describing terror and chaos, the usual." She sipped her own tea, staring out the dark window at the lake beyond. "My PR team is having a field day trying to control the narrative." "What's the narrative?" "That depends." Avery turned to look at him directly. What do you want it to be? Owen frowned, not understanding. I don't want it to be anything. I just want to take my son home and try to forget this whole night happened. Forget? Avery's eyebrows rose. Owen, you're a hero. You saved 300 people. The media is going to find out who you are, what you did. There's no avoiding that. The word hero made Owen's stomach turn. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who used to fly planes. Anyone with the training could have done what I did. But they didn't. You did. Avery set down her mug with a soft click. And I need to know something. Why were you on that plane? Where were you coming from? My mother's funeral. I told you that. And where do you work? What do you do when you're not saving crashing aircraft? Owen's jaw tightened. He sensed where this was going, and he didn't like it. I'm a mechanic. Contract work, mostly small aircraft maintenance at Boeing Field. Some freelance jobs. I get by. With a 6-year-old son to support. We manage. Do you? Avery's gaze was penetrating, seeing more than Owen wanted to show. Do you have health insurance, benefits, any kind of stability? That's none of your business. It became my business the moment you sat down next to me on that plane. Avery's voice was gentle but firm. Owen, I looked you up while you were upstairs. I have access to industry databases, employment records. You've applied to every major airline in the last 5 years. United, Delta, Southwest, Alaska, and my company, Meridian Aviation, multiple times. Owen felt heat creeping up his neck. So? So you were rejected every single time. Do you know why? He did. He'd memorized the rejection letters, the polite language that couldn't quite hide the truth. Gaps in employment history, medical holds related to PTSD, failed psych evaluations. The words tasted bitter. The airlines don't want damaged goods in their cockpits. Can't say I blame them. I can, Avery said sharply. I absolutely can. Because our algorithms, our hiring systems, our corporate policies filtered you out automatically. We never saw your application reach a human being. We never knew that the man we rejected was someone who could do what you did tonight. Owen stared at her, not sure where she was going with this. The system failed you, Avery continued, and tonight it almost failed 300 passengers because the one person who could save them was someone we'd already dismissed as unemployable. She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. I'm the CEO of the company that rejected you, the company whose aircraft you just landed. Do you understand what I'm saying? That you feel guilty? That I'm horrified? Avery's voice cracked slightly. I built those systems, Owen. I approved those algorithms. I signed off on policies designed to minimize risk and maximize efficiency, and in doing so I created a hiring process that excludes people like you, veterans with trauma, pilots with gaps in their history, anyone who doesn't fit the perfect corporate profile we've decided is acceptable. You were doing your job. My job almost killed everyone on that plane tonight. Avery laughed, but there was no humor in it. If you hadn't been on board, if you hadn't been sitting next to me by pure chance, Sarah and I and 300 other people would be dead right now. Dead because the system I created decided you weren't worth a second look. Owen set down his mug, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. What do you want me to say? That I'm angry? I am. I've been angry for 5 years, angry at the Air Force for discharging me, angry at the airlines for rejecting me, angry at myself for not being able to just get over what happened and move on. He ran a hand through his damp hair. But being angry doesn't change anything. The rules exist for reasons. Airlines can't take chances with unstable pilots. You're not unstable. I have PTSD. I have panic attacks when I even think about flying. I haven't been in a cockpit in 5 years because the last time I tried, I threw up and had to be helped out by security. Owen's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts he'd accepted as immutable. That's not someone you want responsible for passenger safety. And yet tonight you got into that cockpit anyway. Despite the PTSD, despite the panic, despite everything that terrified you. Avery leaned forward, her intensity almost physical. You did it because you had to, because people needed you. That's not instability, Owen. That's courage. Or desperation. What's the difference? She smiled slightly. I've run a company for 7 years. I've made 1,000 difficult decisions. And you know what I've learned? The best people aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel it and do what needs to be done anyway. Owen didn't know how to respond to that. He'd spent 5 years defining himself by his limitations, by his trauma, by all the things he couldn't do anymore. Having someone, especially someone like Avery, suggest that those very things might be strengths rather than weaknesses made something shift uncomfortably in his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. Avery straightened, and suddenly the CEO was back, the executive who made decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. "Because tomorrow morning I'm going to start dismantling the hiring systems that rejected you. I'm going to implement new policies that require human review of every application, especially from veterans. I'm going to create pathways back into aviation for people who've been sidelined by trauma or gaps in their history." That's good. Those are good changes. And I'm going to offer you a job." Owen blinked. "What?" "Not as a pilot. Not yet. You're not current. You'd need recertification, medical clearance, the whole process. But as a trainer, as a consultant, someone who can help us identify other pilots like you, experienced, skilled, but locked out of the system." Avery's eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. "Help me fix this, Owen. Help me make sure what happened tonight, both the bad and the good, never happens again." I can't," Owen floundered, overwhelmed. "This is happening too fast. I just crashed a plane a few hours ago. I need to process. I need to think." "I know. I'm sorry. That was too much, too fast." Avery held up her hands apologetically. "Forget I said anything. Sleep on it. We'll talk more tomorrow when we're not both running on trauma and adrenaline." But Owen couldn't let it go, couldn't stop thinking about what she'd offered, what it might mean. A pathway back. Not just for him, but for others like him, veterans who'd been cast aside, pilots who'd been deemed too risky despite their skills. The chance to matter again. To use what he knew to help instead of standing on the sidelines watching from maintenance hangars. The chance to fly again. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure, which told Owen more than any rational analysis could. If he was feeling anything at all about flying besides pure dread, something had changed tonight. Something fundamental. "I'll think about it," he heard himself say. "That's all I can promise right now." Avery smiled, real warmth in it this time. "That's all I'm asking." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd been strangers 12 hours ago and were now bound by shared trauma and survival. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Dawn was still hours away, but the storm had passed, leaving behind only puddles and the promise of clearing skies. "Go sleep," Avery said finally. "Your son needs his father rested. We all do." Owen went upstairs and slid into the bed beside Ethan, careful not to wake him. His son shifted, made a small sound, then settled back into deep sleep. Owen lay there staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the landing over and over. The feel of the controls, the sound of the engines, the moment when the gear collapsed and he'd thought they were going to die. But they hadn't. They'd lived. All of them. And somewhere in the chaos and terror of those minutes, Owen had found something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Not the absence of fear, that would probably never go away, but the ability to function despite it. The knowledge that he could still do the job when it mattered most. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what he'd needed to find before he could move forward. He fell asleep with his hand on Ethan's back, feeling his son breathe, and for the first time in 5 years he didn't dream of fire and falling and friends who didn't come home. He dreamed of sky. Owen woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and the sound of his son's laughter drifting up from somewhere below. For a disoriented moment he couldn't place where he was, his hand reaching instinctively for the empty space beside him before memory crashed back. The flight, the landing, Avery's house. He sat up slowly, his body cataloging new aches and pains, shoulders tight from fighting the controls, a bruise on his ribs from the harness, hands stiff from gripping the yoke too hard for too long. The clock on the nightstand read 9:43. He'd slept nearly 7 hours, more than he usually managed even on good nights. The smell of coffee and something cooking drew him downstairs, where he found Ethan at the kitchen island, still in his Captain America shirt from yesterday, swinging his legs and eating pancakes while Avery stood at the stove flipping more. "Dad!" Ethan's face lit up. "Miss Avery makes really good pancakes."
And she has the good syrup, not the fake kind we get. "Morning," Avery said without turning from the stove. She was back in professional clothes, slacks and a blouse, though her feet were bare and her hair was pulled into a casual ponytail. "Coffee's fresh. Mugs are in the cabinet to the left of the sink." Owen poured himself a cup and sat down beside his son, accepting a plate of pancakes that looked infinitely better than anything he'd managed to produce in their tiny apartment kitchen. "You didn't have to do all this." "I was up anyway. Conference calls with the insurance adjusters started at 6. Avery finally turned to face him, and Owen could see the exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. "The FAA wants statements from both you and Sarah by this afternoon. I've arranged for a lawyer to be present if you want one."
"Do I need a lawyer?"
"No. But given what you did last night, given that you're not current on your certifications and weren't officially part of the crew, it's better to have representation, just in case someone decides to make an issue of it." She sat down across from them with her own coffee. "There are people who think you're a hero. There are also people who think you violated about 17 different regulations by entering that cockpit." "I did violate them," Owen said quietly, cutting his pancakes into precise squares the way Ethan liked his cut. "I'm not certified on the 737. I haven't flown commercially. I shouldn't have been anywhere near those controls." "And 300 people would be dead if you hadn't." Avery's voice was firm. "That's what matters. That's what I'll be telling the FAA, the NTSB, and anyone else who asks." Ethan looked between them, syrup smeared on his cheek. "Are you in trouble, Dad?" "No, buddy, just some grown-up paperwork stuff. Nothing to worry about." But Owen was worried. He knew enough about aviation regulations to understand that what he'd done existed in a massive gray area. Good Samaritan laws might protect him from liability, but they didn't necessarily protect him from enforcement actions. The FAA could decide he'd acted recklessly, could revoke what certifications he did still have, could make sure he never flew again even if he wanted to. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Owen pulled it out and stared at the screen showing 43 missed calls and over 100 text messages. His hands went numb. "That started around 6 this morning," Avery said. "Someone leaked your name to the press. By 7, you were trending on social media. By 8, the story was on every major news network." She pulled out her own phone and turned it to show him. The screen displayed a news article with the headline, "Hero Pilot Saves Doomed Flight. Former Air Force Veteran Steps Up When Captain Falls Ill." Owen's face stared back at him from the phone, a photo clearly pulled from his old military records. He looked younger in it, unbroken, wearing his dress uniform and actually smiling. The man in that photo felt like a stranger. "I didn't give them permission to use that," he said, his voice hollow. "They don't need permission. You're a public figure now, whether you want to be or not." Avery's expression was sympathetic. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted." Owen scrolled through the messages. Reporters requesting interviews. Old Air Force buddies he hadn't spoken to in years asking if he was okay. Complete strangers sending congratulations and thanks. His former commander from his transport squadron asking him to call. And buried in all of it, several messages from Alaska Airlines, United, even Delta, airlines that had rejected him multiple times, now suddenly interested in discussing opportunities. "They're vultures," he muttered, shoving the phone back in his pocket. 6 months ago, I couldn't get a call back for a basic line pilot position. Now that I'm news, suddenly everyone wants to talk." "That's how it works," Avery said, and there was an edge of bitterness in her tone that suggested she had her own experience with fair weather interest. "Success is attractive. Survival even more so. These airlines see PR value in being associated with the hero of Flight 447. "I don't want to be a hero. I don't want any of this attention." Owen looked at Ethan, who was watching him with worried eyes. "I just want to take my son home and get back to normal." "Normal ended the moment you walked into that cockpit," Avery said gently. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because you need to understand what's coming. There will be interviews whether you give them or not. There will be speculation, analysis, people picking apart every decision you made. You can either control that narrative or let it control you." Owen pushed his barely touched pancakes away, his appetite gone. What do you suggest? Do one interview, a good one, with someone reputable. Tell your story on your terms. Then refuse all other requests and let it die down. Avery leaned forward. And accept my job offer. Come work for Meridian. Let me give you a platform to actually change things instead of just being a feel-good news story that everyone forgets in a week. You're serious about that? The job? Completely. I've already drafted a proposal for our board. We're creating a new position, Director of Pilot Integration and Support. Your role would be to overhaul our hiring practices, create support systems for pilots dealing with trauma or mental health issues, and serve as a liaison between our flight operations and HR departments. She pulled out a folder from a briefcase Owen hadn't noticed by the counter. The salary is here, along with benefits, relocation assistance if you need it. It's a real job, Owen, not charity. I need someone who understands both the operational and human sides of aviation. Someone who's been through the system and knows where it breaks. Owen stared at the folder like it might bite him. I'm not qualified for this. I fix planes, I turn wrenches, I don't do corporate jobs with titles and presentations, and you saved 300 lives with nothing but training you hadn't used in 5 years and determination. You kept a first officer from falling apart when her captain collapsed. You made decisions under pressure that most experienced pilots couldn't handle. Avery slid the folder across the counter to him. That's exactly the kind of qualification I need, someone who's lived it, someone who gives a damn about the people, not just the metrics. Ethan had stopped eating, his attention fully on the conversation, even if he didn't understand all of it. What's relocation mean? It means moving, Owen said softly. Leaving our apartment, maybe finding a new place. Would we move here? To this house? Ethan's eyes were wide with hope. The apartment they shared was barely 600 square feet, one room with a Murphy bed and a bathroom that had mold Owen couldn't seem to eliminate, no matter how much bleach he used. Nobody, Miss Avery's house is hers. We'd find our own place. But a bigger place? With my own room? Owen's chest tightened. He'd been saving for years to get them into a 2-bedroom, but mechanics' wages and Seattle rent made it an impossible goal that kept receding further into the future. Maybe. We'll see. Take it home, Avery said, gesturing to the folder. Read it over. Talk to Ethan about it. Think about what you want your life to look like 6 months from now, a year from now. Then call me. Before Owen could respond, the doorbell rang. Avery's expression shifted to annoyance as she went to answer it. Owen heard voices in the entryway. Avery's firm and authoritative, someone else's apologetic but insistent. She returned a moment later looking grim. There are reporters outside. Someone must have followed you here last night or tracked down my address. I've called security, but we should go. Owen stood, already looking for Ethan's shoes. We've imposed enough, and I don't want to bring this circus to your doorstep. Where will you go? Your apartment address is probably public by now, too. Owen hadn't thought of that. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it to see a message from his landlord. Media trucks outside building, some trying to get in. Might want to stay elsewhere for a few days. Perfect. Just perfect. There's a hotel near Boeing Field, Owen said, thinking out loud. Nothing fancy, but it's cheap, and they don't ask questions. Absolutely not. Avery pulled out her phone. I have a property on Bainbridge Island. Family cabin, totally private. Nobody knows about it because it's in a trust. You can stay there until this dies down. It's about a 40-minute ferry ride, but it's quiet and off the grid. Avery, you've already done too much. I'm not arguing about this. Her tone was pure CEO, brooking no disagreement. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. The least I can do is give you a safe place to let your son process what happened without cameras in his face. The cabin is yours for as long as you need it. Owen wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to maintain some independence, some dignity. But Ethan was looking at him with an expression that was too old for a 6-year-old, already learning to read the stress in his father's body language. And Owen realized that his pride was less important than his son's peace of mind. Thank you, he said quietly. We'll take you up on that. Avery made arrangements with swift efficiency while Owen gathered their minimal belongings. She had a car brought around to the back entrance, away from the gathering reporters, and gave Owen keys to the cabin along with detailed directions. She also pressed a credit card into his hand. Corporate card, she said when he tried to refuse. For food and supplies. Consider it a business expense. You're a consultant now, remember? I haven't accepted the job yet. But you will. She smiled. I'm very good at reading people, Owen. You want to say yes, you're just scared of what saying yes might mean. She wasn't wrong. Owen thanked her again, loaded Ethan into the car, and pulled out of the driveway just as a news van rounded the corner. The driver Avery had sent was professional and silent, navigating them through morning traffic to the ferry terminal without asking questions or making conversation. The ferry ride was peaceful in a surreal way. Ethan pressed his face to the window watching the water, pointing out seagulls and other boats, while Owen stared at his phone and the folder Avery had given him. He should probably read through the job offer, examine the details, think rationally about whether this was the right move. Instead, he found himself scrolling through news articles about the crash. Most of them were factually accurate, recounting the lightning strike and systems failures, the emergency landing and miraculous survival rate. But they painted him as something he wasn't, a hero who'd calmly taken control and guided everyone to safety. They didn't mention the paralyzing fear, the way his hands had shaken, the fact that he'd nearly refused to help at all. They certainly didn't mention Jake, didn't know that every moment in that cockpit Owen had been fighting ghosts as much as physics. One article included quotes from passengers. A woman from row 15 saying she'd prayed and knew they'd be saved. The teenage boy talking about how he'd held an elderly man's hand during the landing. And Avery, identified as Meridian Aviation's CEO, giving a carefully worded statement about the heroism of everyone involved and her company's commitment to investigating what went wrong. "Dad, look!" Ethan pointed out the window at a seal bobbing in the ferry's wake. "Can we see seals at the cabin?" "Maybe, buddy. I don't know what's out there." "Miss Avery is nice. I like her." Ethan turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Do you like her?" Owen felt his face heat slightly. "She's been very kind to us. She looks at you funny." "What do you mean funny?" "Like you're important." Ethan swung his legs, Mr. Trunks tucked under his arm. "Grandma used to say you were important too, but you never believed her. Maybe you should believe Miss Avery." Out of the mouths of children. Owen pulled his son close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "When did you get so smart?" "I was always smart. You just don't always listen." The cabin turned out to be less of a cabin and more of a house, though rustic enough to earn the label. It sat on 3 acres of wooded property with water views, 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace that looked like it actually worked. There were books on the shelves, games in a closet, a deck out back with furniture that had weathered multiple winters. It felt lived in, loved, like a place where people came to remember who they were away from the demands of regular life. Ethan immediately claimed the smaller bedroom, the one with bunk beds and a window overlooking the trees. Owen unpacked their meager belongings, the same clothes they'd worn on the flight plus the sweats Avery had lent him, and then stood in the living room feeling unmoored and strange. 24 hours ago, he'd been a mechanic living paycheck to paycheck, his biggest concern getting Ethan through kindergarten and maybe saving enough for a used car to replace the one that had finally died last month. Now he was hiding from reporters in a borrowed house, offered a job he wasn't qualified for, his face on the news being called a hero by people who didn't know him. His phone rang. Owen glanced at it and saw Sarah's name. He answered. "Hey." Her voice was tentative. "I hope it's okay that I called. I got your number from the crew manifest. I just wanted to check if you're okay." "I'm okay. Hiding out for a bit until the media circus calms down. You?" "Same. My parents' house in Tacoma. The FAA interviewed me this morning. They were intense but fair. They're calling what we did an emergency authority situation, pilot in command making decisions necessary for safety of flight." She paused. "They said what you did was legal, irregular but legal." Owen felt tension he hadn't known he was carrying released slightly. "That's good. Owen, I need to say something. Last night I couldn't really process what happened, but now that I've had time to think, I need you to know that I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not being enough. For needing you to save us. I'm the first officer. I'm supposed to be capable of handling emergencies, and I froze. And people could have died because I wasn't good enough." Owen recognized the tone, the self-recrimination. He'd lived in that space for 5 years. Sarah, listen to me. You didn't freeze. You kept that aircraft flying when the captain went down. You managed multiple systems failures while staying on instruments in weather that would have challenged pilots with 20 years more experience than you. You didn't break. You bent, which is exactly what you're supposed to do under that kind of stress. I couldn't have landed it alone. Maybe not, but nobody should have to land it alone. That's why cockpits are designed for 2 pilots. You did your job, I did mine. We were a crew, and the crew succeeded. That's all that matters. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. The airline wants me to take time off, mandated trauma counseling before they'll let me fly again. Part of me is relieved. The other part feels like a failure. Taking time to heal isn't failure, it's survival. I learned that the hard way. Owen walked out onto the deck, watching Ethan through the window as the boy arranged his stuffed animals on the bunk bed. If you want my advice, take the time. Do the counseling. Don't make my mistake of trying to just push through and pretend you're fine. The trauma doesn't go away on its own. Is that what happened to you after you left the Air Force? Owen hadn't told her that story. Hadn't told anyone except the therapist he'd been required to see. But Sarah had earned some honesty. I lost my co-pilot in a training accident, enemy fire during a supply run in Afghanistan. He died. I survived. And I couldn't reconcile why. Couldn't function in a cockpit without seeing him in the seat next to me. So I ran. I quit flying because flying hurt too much. But you came back. Last night, you came back. Because I had to. Because my son was on that plane and I couldn't let him die. Owen gripped the deck railing. I don't know if that fixed me, Sarah. I don't know if one successful landing erases 5 years of trauma. But I know I did something I thought was impossible. And maybe that means other impossible things are possible too. They talked for a few more minutes, 2 pilots who'd been strangers yesterday and were now bound by shared survival and the weight of what they'd done. When Owen hung up, he stood on the deck for a long time, watching the trees sway and the clouds move across the sky. It was a beautiful day, the kind of clear autumn afternoon where you could see forever if you climbed high enough. He thought about Avery's job offer, about returning to aviation not as a pilot but as someone who could help fix the broken systems that had sidelined him and countless others. It was tempting in ways he hadn't expected, the chance to matter again, to use his experience for something beyond just keeping himself and Ethan afloat. But it was also terrifying. Taking that job meant stepping back into the world that had broken him. It meant facing the industry that had rejected him over and over, meant putting himself in situations where he'd have to talk about what happened to Jake, about his limitations, about all the ways he'd failed. Dad, Ethan called from inside. Can we make lunch? I'm hungry. Owen went inside and found his son had already pulled out bread and peanut butter from the supplies Avery's people had stocked the cabin with. They made sandwiches together, Ethan chattering about the seals and whether there might be deer in the woods. Normal 6-year-old concerns, as if yesterday hadn't happened, as if they hadn't nearly died. Children were resilient in ways adults couldn't manage. Ethan would probably have nightmares, would probably need to talk through what happened once it all settled in. But right now he was focused on sandwiches and animals and whether they could explore the woods before dark. He trusted that his father had saved them, trusted that the world was still safe despite evidence to the contrary, trusted with the complete faith that only children possess. Owen wanted to protect that faith, that innocence. And maybe the way to do that wasn't by hiding and staying small and pretending the crash hadn't happened. Maybe it was by being brave enough to step forward into the fear and show Ethan that scared wasn't the same as defeated. After lunch, Owen opened the folder Avery had given him. The job description was detailed and comprehensive, outlining responsibilities that felt both overwhelming and intriguing. Director of Pilot Integration and Support. It wasn't just about hiring, it was about creating support systems, advocating for pilots' mental health, serving as a bridge between corporate policy and operational reality. It was a chance to actually change things instead of just surviving them. The salary made Owen's breath catch. It was more than triple what he made as a mechanic. Enough to afford a real apartment with space for Ethan to have his own room. Enough for health insurance that actually covered therapy. Enough for stability, security, things Owen had stopped believing were possible for people like him. The benefits package included mental health coverage with no restrictions, relocation assistance up to $20,000, and something that made his eyes burn with unexpected emotion, tuition assistance for dependents, effective immediately. Ethan could go to a better school, could have music lessons or sports if he wanted them, could have the kind of childhood Owen had been struggling to provide on mechanics' wages. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was Virginia. Military country. Owen answered cautiously. Owen Parker? An older man's voice, familiar, but Owen couldn't place it. Speaking. This is Colonel Morrison. I was your squadron commander back at Little Rock. Owen sat up straighter automatically, old training kicking in. Colonel, sir, I didn't expect to hear from you. I've been trying to reach you since I saw the news this morning. Hell of a thing you did last night, son. Hell of a thing. Morrison's voice carried genuine warmth. I wanted you to know how proud I am, how proud we all are. You upheld everything we tried to teach you about courage and service. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. But I also wanted you to know that your discharge was a mistake. I fought it at the time, thought you needed treatment and support, not a medical separation. But I was overruled by people who only saw liability and didn't see the pilot. Morrison paused. If you're interested, I know people at Air Force Reserve Command. They've been working on better support systems for pilots with PTSD, trying to create pathways back for qualified aviators who were pushed out. I could make some calls, see about getting you back in if that's something you'd want. Owen's throat tightened. I appreciate that, sir, but I don't think I'm ready for that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. That's fair. Doors open if you change your mind. Morrison's tone shifted slightly. I also heard you've been having trouble finding civilian work. Airlines not calling you back. That's putting it mildly. Bastards. You're one of the best pilots I ever trained. Natural ability combined with humility, which is rare as hell. The colonel's voice hardened. You tell those civilian outfits that they're idiots for not seeing your value. And Owen? Whatever you decide to do next, know that you've still got people in your corner. You're not alone in this. They talked for a few more minutes, Morrison sharing news about Owen's old squadron mates, asking about Ethan, offering support that felt genuine rather than obligatory. When Owen hung up, he realized he was crying, tears running down his face for the second time in 24 hours. He'd spent 5 years thinking he'd burned every bridge, severed every connection to his old life. To learn that some of those bridges still stood, that people still believed in him, cracked something open in his chest that had been locked tight for too long. Ethan found him like that, sitting on the couch with his face in his hands. His son climbed up beside him without speaking, just pressing close the way he did when Owen had nightmares. The boy didn't ask what was wrong. He just held Mr. Trunks out, offering the comfort of the worn elephant the way Owen had offered it to him last night. Owen pulled his son into his lap and held him, letting himself feel everything he'd been suppressing. Grief for Jake, anger at the system that had rejected him, fear about the future, hope that maybe things could be different, gratitude that they were both alive and together. All of it mixed together until he couldn't separate one emotion from another and didn't need to. I'm thinking about taking a new job, Owen said when he could speak again. It would mean some changes, new place to live, different schedule, but it would also mean I could be home more, could give you things I haven't been able to before. Would you be happy? Ethan asked, his 6-year-old wisdom cutting straight to what mattered. Would he be happy? Owen didn't know, but he thought he might be something better than happy, useful, purposeful, connected to something larger than just survival. I think I might be, eventually. Then we should do it. Ethan said it with such simple certainty, as if the decision was already made and everything else was just details. Maybe it was that simple. Maybe Owen had been overcomplicating things, looking for guarantees and certainties that didn't exist. The job was a risk. Stepping back into aviation was a risk. All of it could go wrong in 100 different ways. But staying where he was, hiding in his small life and smaller ambitions, that was its own kind of failure. Owen pulled out his phone and typed a message to Avery. I'll take the job. When do I start? Her response came back within 30 seconds. Take 2 weeks to settle in and find a place. Report to headquarters December 9th. Welcome to Meridian Aviation, Owen. Let's fix this broken system together. Owen showed Ethan the message and watched his son's face light up with excitement. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the woods around the cabin, finding deer tracks and a stream with minnows, playing a game where Ethan was a paleontologist discovering dinosaur bones, and Owen was his assistant. Normal father-son time, the kind they'd been too stressed and too broke to have much of lately. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Owen stood on the deck and looked up at the darkening sky. The first stars were appearing, bright points in the gathering darkness. He thought about what Avery had said, about control and courage and the difference between them. He thought about Sarah learning to forgive herself, about Colonel Morrison saying he was proud, about Ethan's simple faith that his father would always find a way. He thought about Jake, who'd been his best friend and his co-pilot and had died because Owen hadn't been fast enough or good enough to save him. 5 years Owen had carried that weight, had let it define him and limit him and convince him he didn't deserve a second chance. But Jake wouldn't have wanted that. Jake, who'd made stupid jokes during pre-flight checks and had sung off-key in the cockpit and had been absolutely fearless in the face of danger, wouldn't have wanted Owen to stop living because he'd stopped. Jake would have told him to get back in the cockpit, would have made some ridiculous wager about Owen being too scared to fly again, would have needled and pushed until Owen had no choice but to prove him wrong. "I did it, Jake," Owen whispered to the darkening sky, to the memory of his friend, to the part of himself that had died that day in Afghanistan. "I got back in the cockpit. I flew. I brought them home, just like you would have wanted." The stars didn't answer, but Owen felt something shift inside him anyway. Not healing. That would take time, maybe years more of therapy and hard work. But acknowledgement. Permission to move forward without forgetting, to build something new while honoring what had been lost. Ethan came out onto the deck, wrapped in a blanket, his hair still damp from his bath. "Can we stay here forever?" he asked, leaning against Owen's side. "No, buddy, this is just borrowed time. But we'll find our own place, somewhere good, somewhere that feels like home." "Will you keep flying?" Owen thought about that. The job Avery had offered wasn't a cockpit position. It didn't require him to fly regularly or even at all. He could spend his entire career helping other pilots without ever having to face his own fears again. It would be safe, easy, and it would be a lie. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe, eventually, if I can work up to it." "I think you should," Ethan said with the absolute conviction of childhood. "You're really good at it. You saved everyone." "I got lucky." "No, you were brave." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "That's different than lucky." Owen pulled his son close and stood there watching the stars emerge one by one, each a small light pushing back against the darkness. Tomorrow he'd have to deal with the FAA interviews and the media attention and all the practical realities of starting over. Tomorrow he'd have to be responsible and careful and think about long-term consequences. But tonight he was just a father standing with his son, watching the sky, feeling the weight of what he'd done settle into something he could carry. Not easily, not without effort, but carry it he could, because he'd already proven that when it mattered most, when lives depended on it, he could still do the impossible. He could still fly. The 2 weeks Owen and Ethan spent at the cabin passed in a strange suspension of time, like living inside a snow globe where the outside world couldn't quite reach them. Owen fielded calls from the FAA and gave his official statement with Avery's lawyer present, answered questions about his decision-making process, and his qualifications with an honesty that seemed to satisfy the investigators. They ruled it an emergency authority situation exactly as Sarah had said, and closed their inquiry with a notation that Owen Parker had acted within acceptable parameters given the circumstances. No violations, no penalties, just a formal acknowledgement that he'd done what needed doing. The media attention proved harder to escape. Reporters found the cabin's location within 3 days, though they respected the property line after Avery's legal team made it clear that trespassing would result in immediate lawsuits. Owen did one interview, carefully chosen, with a journalist Avery recommended who had a reputation for fairness. He told his story simply, without embellishment, making sure to credit Sarah and the flight attendants and the ground controllers who'd all played their parts. He talked about Jake for the first time publicly, about losing his co-pilot and his career and his sense of purpose. He talked about Ethan, about being a single father, about the quiet desperation of applying for jobs you're qualified for and being rejected by algorithms that can't see past gaps in a resume. The interview aired on a Tuesday evening and went viral by Wednesday morning. Owen's phone exploded with messages again, but this time they were different. Veterans reaching out to share their own stories of being sidelined by PTSD, pilots who'd been rejected for medical reasons, or employment gaps expressing gratitude that someone had finally said out loud what they'd been living. Mental health advocates praising his honesty about trauma. And surprisingly, 3 major airlines issuing statements about reviewing their hiring practices and creating veteran support programs. Avery called him that Wednesday afternoon, her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "You've started something. The industry is paying attention. My board approved an expanded budget for the integration program based on the response to your interview. We're not just creating one position anymore. We're building an entire department." "That's good," Owen said, watching Ethan build a fort out of couch cushions. "That's really good. It's because of you, because you were willing to be vulnerable in public. That takes a different kind of courage than landing a plane." She paused. "How are you doing with all of this? Really?" Owen considered the question. He'd been having nightmares again, vivid dreams where he was back in the cockpit, but this time the landing went wrong. This time he couldn't save them. He'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, and have to walk through the cabin checking that Ethan was breathing, that they were safe, that the crash existed only in his mind. But he'd also been sleeping better overall, eating properly, feeling something other than the constant low-grade anxiety that had been his companion for 5 years. "I'm managing," he said finally. "Some days are harder than others, but I think I'm moving in the right direction." "Have you thought about what you want to do long-term, beyond the integration director position?" "What do you mean?" "I mean flying, Owen. Do you want to get back in a cockpit? Because if you do, Meridian will support that. We'll pay for recertification, simulator time, whatever you need. But only if it's what you want, not because you think it's expected." Owen looked out the window at the gray December sky, at clouds moving in patterns he could read even from the ground. "I don't know yet. Part of me does. Part of me never wants to fly again. Ask me in 6 months." "Fair enough. The offer stands whenever you're ready." They'd found an apartment in West Seattle, a 2-bedroom place with hardwood floors and enough light that it didn't feel claustrophobic. It cost more than Owen would have been comfortable with on a mechanic's salary, but the Meridian paycheck made it not just possible, but reasonable. Ethan had his own room for the first time in his life, space for his toys and books, and a desk where he could do homework. The boy had been ecstatic, racing from room to room when they'd first walked through, planning where everything would go with the serious concentration of someone who'd never had their own space before. They moved in on a Saturday, with help from Sarah, who'd shown up unannounced with coffee and donuts and a determination to be useful. She and Owen had stayed in touch over the 2 weeks, text messages that started professional and gradually became something like friendship. She was still grounded pending her psych evaluation, still working through the trauma of that night, but she seemed steadier each time they talked. "This is nice," she said, looking around the empty apartment while Ethan ran from room to room, making sound effects. "Really nice. You deserve this." "We got lucky," Owen said, unpacking boxes. "If Avery hadn't been on that plane, if she hadn't seen what the system did to people like me, none of this would be happening. That's not luck. That's you being good at what you do and someone finally recognizing it." Sarah helped him arrange furniture, her movements careful, like she was still worried about breaking things. "Have you talked to any of the passengers besides Avery?" "A few." The elderly couple from across the aisle sent a card. The woman with the head injury called to say thank you. The teenage boy's mother wrote a letter. Owen paused in his unpacking, remembering the letters he'd received, the weight of their gratitude. "They all say the same thing, that I saved them. But I keep thinking about how close we came to not making it. If the runway had been 50 feet shorter, if the wind had been 5 knots stronger, if the gear had collapsed on the left side instead of the right." "But it didn't," Sarah interrupted gently. "You made good decisions with the information you had. You can't judge yourself by all the things that might have gone wrong. That's not fair and it's not rational." "You sound like my therapist." "Good. That means we're both getting the same message." She smiled slightly. I start back on limited duty next week. Simulator only, no passengers yet. They want to make sure I can handle it before they put me back on the line. How do you feel about that? Terrified, but also ready, I think. I need to prove to myself that I can still do this, that one bad night doesn't define my entire career. She looked at him seriously. You taught me that. You came back after 5 years of being too afraid to fly, and you did it when it mattered most. If you can do that, I can get back in a simulator. Ethan appeared in the doorway, dragging Mr. Trunks by one worn ear. Dad, can we go get pizza? I'm starving, and there's no food here. They ordered pizza and ate sitting on the floor of the empty living room, paper plates and plastic cups. Ethan telling Sarah about his new school where he'd start after winter break, about his teacher who seemed nice and the other kids he'd met at orientation. Normal 6-year-old concerns, his resilience complete and absolute in the way only children could manage. Sarah left as the sun was setting, hugging Owen at the door and whispering, "Thank you," one more time before she went. Owen wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. The landing, the encouragement, just being someone who understood what she was going through. But he accepted it and told her to call if she needed anything. That night, after Ethan was asleep in his new room with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling, Owen stood on their small balcony and called his old therapist, the one the Air Force had assigned him after Jake's death. Dr. Martinez answered on the third ring, her voice surprised but warm. "Owen Parker, I saw you on the news. Hell of a thing you did." "I need to start sessions again," Owen said without preamble. "I thought I was managing okay, thought I'd moved past the worst of it. But after the landing, after everything that's happened, I realize I've just been avoiding it. And I can't keep avoiding it if I'm going to do this job right. I'm proud of you for recognizing that. A lot of people in your situation would try to ride the hero momentum and ignore the underlying trauma." Her tone shifted to professional. "I have space on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We should start with twice a week and see how it goes." They set up the appointments, and Owen felt something loosen in his chest. He'd been carrying everything alone for so long, trying to be strong enough for Ethan, not wanting to burden anyone with his broken pieces. But strength didn't mean doing it alone. It meant being smart enough to ask for help when you needed it. December 9th arrived faster than Owen expected. He dropped Ethan at his new school, a better facility than the underfunded public school they'd been zoned for before, with actual resources and teachers who seemed engaged, and drove to Meridian Aviation's headquarters in Bellevue. The building was glass and steel, modern and imposing, the kind of place he'd sent resumes to dozens of times without ever actually seeing. Avery met him in the lobby personally, which seemed unusual for a CEO, but was apparently just her style. She wore a sharp suit and her professional armor, but her smile when she saw him was genuine and warm. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, leading him to the elevators. "Honestly, I'm terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing." "Perfect. That means you'll ask questions and learn instead of assuming you know everything." She pressed the button for the 7th floor. "I've set you up with an office, a team of 3 people who will report to you, and a budget that should give you room to actually make changes. Your first priority is reviewing our current hiring practices and identifying where they're failing people like you. Second priority is creating support systems for current pilots dealing with mental health issues. Third is developing training programs for management on how to actually support pilots instead of just managing metrics." The elevator doors opened, and Owen followed her down a hallway lined with offices, people nodding to Avery as they passed. She stopped at a door with a nameplate that read, "Owen Parker, Director of Pilot Integration and Support," and pushed it open. The office was modest but real. A desk, a window with a view of the parking lot and mountains beyond, bookshelves waiting to be filled, a computer already set up with his login credentials. Owen stood in the doorway feeling like an imposter, like someone would realize any moment that he didn't belong here. "I'll let you settle in," Avery said. "Your team will meet you at 10 for introductions and overview. If you need anything, I'm 3 floors up. And Owen?" She waited until he looked at her. "You earned this. Not because of the landing, but because you understand this industry from the inside and you care about fixing it. Trust yourself." The first weeks were overwhelming in the best and worst ways. Owen met his team, a data analyst named Marcus, who could break down hiring patterns with frightening precision, an HR specialist named Jennifer who'd been advocating for policy changes for years without support, and a former pilot named David who'd been medically grounded after a cancer diagnosis and understood intimately how the system abandoned people the moment they became complicated. They were smart, dedicated, and thrilled to finally have someone in a position of authority who took their work seriously. Together, they began dismantling the algorithmic filters that had rejected Owen and countless others. Marcus showed him the data in stark terms. The automated system rejected 73% of veteran applicants due to employment gaps or medical flags, never showing their applications to human reviewers. It rejected pilots who'd taken time off for family emergencies, for mental health treatment, for anything that deviated from the perfect linear career trajectory. It's designed to minimize risk, Marcus explained, his screen showing charts and graphs that made Owen's stomach turn. But it defines risk as anything unpredictable, which means it automatically excludes anyone who's experienced trauma, hardship, or basically any real-life complication. So we fix it, Owen said, and he heard echoes of the command voice he'd used in the cockpit that night, the certainty that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done. Every application gets human review. Every veteran application gets reviewed by someone who understands military service. Every medical flag gets actual assessment by a flight surgeon, not just automatic rejection. That's going to slow down hiring significantly, Jennifer warned, and it's going to cost more. I don't care. We nearly lost 300 people because the cheap, fast system filtered out the one person who could save them. If we have to hire slower and spend more to actually see people instead of resumes, that's what we'll do. They implemented the changes over 3 months, fighting resistance from finance and operations every step of the way. Owen learned to navigate corporate politics, to build coalitions, to present data in ways that made executives understand the human cost of their efficiency metrics. He learned to use his story when he needed to, the weight of being the pilot from Flight 447 opening doors that would have stayed closed to an unknown mechanic. He also started working with current Meridian pilots, creating support groups for those dealing with mental health issues, establishing confidential counseling services that wouldn't trigger automatic medical reviews, developing peer support programs where experienced pilots could help newer ones navigate the stress and pressure. The participation was slow at first, pilots afraid that admitting struggle would cost them their careers. But gradually, as word spread that the programs were genuinely confidential and supportive, people started showing up. Owen met a captain in his 50s who'd been having panic attacks before flights, but hiding it because he was 3 years from retirement and couldn't afford to lose his medical certificate. He met a first officer who'd developed depression after a messy divorce and was self-medicating with alcohol because he didn't know where else to turn. He met a dozen pilots who were suffering in silence because the system punished vulnerability. "You're giving them permission to be human," David said, after one particularly emotional support group session. "That's revolutionary in this industry. We spent decades telling pilots they have to be perfect machines, never showing weakness. You're saying it's okay to struggle as long as you're getting help. That changes everything." But the hardest part wasn't the corporate battles or the program development. It was facing his own return to the cockpit. Avery had made good on her promise, offering Owen full support for recertification. The company would pay for simulator time, flight instruction, medical evaluations, everything he needed to be line qualified on the 737. All he had to do was say yes. He spent 4 months saying not yet, focusing on his director work, convincing himself he didn't need to fly to be effective in his role. Dr. Martinez called him on it in therapy, her voice gentle but firm. "What are you afraid of, Owen?" "That I can't do it. That the landing was a fluke, adrenaline and luck, and if I try again I'll freeze or fail or you'll prove to yourself that you're actually capable, and that scares you more than failure." Owen sat with that for a long time. Why would being capable scare me? Because if you're capable, you can't hide anymore. You have to actually live, actually try, actually risk being hurt again. She leaned forward in her chair, her expression compassionate. Jake's death wasn't your fault. The system rejecting you wasn't your fault. But staying small and scared when you're ready to be more, that would be your choice. He started simulator training on a Tuesday in April, 6 months after the crash. The instructor was a retired captain named Williams, who Avery had personally selected, someone with a reputation for patience and an understanding of trauma. Owen sat in the left seat of the simulator and felt his hands start shaking before they'd even powered up the systems. "We're going to take this slow," Williams said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Today, we're just going to run through pre-flight checks, get you comfortable with the switches and procedures again. No flying, just systems familiarization." They spent 2 hours working through checklists, Owen's muscle memory returning in fits and starts, his hands remembering where things were even when his mind went blank. Williams talked him through the panic when it came, reminded him to breathe, never pushed harder than Owen could handle. By the end of the session, Owen was exhausted, but also quietly amazed. He'd sat in a cockpit and hadn't thrown up. That felt like victory. The simulator sessions became twice weekly, then 3 times a week as Owen's confidence built. They progressed from systems to taxi procedures to simple takeoffs and landings. Williams threw in scenarios gradually: engine failures, system malfunctions, bad weather approaches. Each one triggered Owen's trauma in different ways, but each one he worked through with Williams's patient guidance. "You're doing well," Williams said after a particularly challenging session where Owen had landed a simulated aircraft with complete hydraulic failure. "Better than well. You have instincts most pilots spend decades developing. You feel the aircraft instead of just flying it by the numbers." "I had a good teacher," Owen said, and he was thinking about Jake, about all the hours they'd spent in the C-130 learning to trust each other and the aircraft completely. Sarah accompanied him to one of the sessions in May, sitting in the right seat the way she had that night. They flew together in the simulator, running through the scenario from Flight 447, but this time with everything working, with both pilots prepared and qualified. It was therapeutic for both of them, a chance to rewrite the trauma with competence and choice instead of desperation. "We make a good crew," Sarah said when they'd finished, the simulated aircraft safely on the ground, with no collapsed gear or disaster. "When you're ready to come back to the line, I want to fly with you." "You trust me that much?" "I trust you more than anyone. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. And more than that, you taught me that it's okay to be afraid as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what matters." Owen's first real flight came in July, a simple training mission with Williams in the right seat and empty seats behind them. They took off from Boeing Field on a clear summer morning, the 737 climbing into blue sky while Owen's hands moved over controls that felt like coming home. His heart raced and his palms sweated, and part of his brain screamed at him to land immediately, but he kept flying. They did touch and goes at smaller airports, practiced approaches in visual conditions, stayed up for 2 hours before returning to Boeing Field. When they'd shut down the engines and completed the post-flight checks, Williams turned to Owen with a rare smile. "How do you feel?" "Terrified. Exhilarated. Like I just did something impossible." Owen looked out at the tarmac, at the other aircraft moving around them, at the sky that had been closed to him for so long. "Like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought." "You were never broken. Just hurt. There's a difference." Owen completed his recertification in August, passing his check ride with scores that surprised everyone, including himself. The FAA examiner, a crusty former military pilot named Harrison, signed off on his certificate and then shook his hand firmly. "I know who you are," Harrison said. "I know what you did on 447. That took guts. This—" he gestured to the aircraft they'd just flown. "This takes a different kind of guts. Getting back up after you've been knocked down. That's the measure of a real pilot." Meridian put Owen on limited duty at first, flying as a relief pilot on domestic routes, building hours and confidence gradually. He flew with Sarah when their schedules aligned, the two of them comfortable in their shared history and mutual understanding. He flew with captains who'd heard his story and with young first officers who had no idea who he was. Each flight added to his logbook and chipped away at his fear until flying became something approaching normal again. Ethan thrived in his new school, making friends and discovering passions Owen hadn't known were there. The boy joined the science club and announced he still wanted to be a paleontologist, but maybe also an astronaut. He talked about his dad being a pilot with unself-conscious pride, brought home drawings of airplanes for Owen to put on the refrigerator, asked questions about how wings generated lift and why clouds formed at different altitudes. On a Saturday in October, Owen took Ethan to the airfield for the first time since the crash. They walked through the hangar where Owen had worked as a mechanic, where his former boss greeted them warmly and showed Ethan around. Then Owen led his son to where a small Cessna was parked, a two-seater trainer that Meridian owned for pilot proficiency.
"Want to go flying?" Owen asked. Ethan's eyes went huge. "Really? Just us?" "Just us, if you want to." They went through the pre-flight together, Owen explaining each check, each surface, each component, while Ethan listened with intense concentration. They strapped in and Owen walked his son through the startup procedure, letting him help with some of the switches. Then they taxied to the runway, Owen calling out to ground control while Ethan pressed his face to the window watching everything. "Ready?" Owen asked as they reached the runway threshold. "Ready!" Ethan practically vibrated with excitement. Owen advanced the throttle and the Cessna accelerated, light and responsive compared to the heavy jets he'd been flying. The wheels lifted off and they climbed into autumn sky, Seattle spreading out below them in a patchwork of neighborhoods and water and green spaces. Ethan laughed with pure joy, pointing out their apartment building, his school, the Space Needle in the distance. "This is so cool. Can we do a loop?" "Not in this aircraft, buddy, but maybe someday when you're older, I'll teach you to fly, and you can do all the loops you want." They flew for an hour, Owen showing his son the mountains and the islands, letting him hold the yoke for a few minutes under careful supervision, watching the wonder on Ethan's face as the world spread out beneath them. And somewhere during that flight, Owen realized that the sky wasn't haunted anymore. Jake would always be part of it, his memory woven into every control input and every decision. But it was also just sky now, beautiful and challenging and full of possibility. When they landed, Ethan threw his arms around Owen's neck. "That was the best day ever. Can we do it again?" "Yeah, buddy, we can do it again." A year after the crash, Meridian hosted a memorial event for Flight 447. Not to mourn, everyone had survived, but to honor the crew and passengers, and to mark the anniversary of the night that had changed so many lives. The event was held in a hotel ballroom. 300 people gathered with their families, many of them still processing what they'd been through. Owen attended with Ethan, both of them dressed up, Ethan's hair actually combed for once. Sarah was there with her parents, looking healthy and confident, back on full flight status and already being considered for captain upgrade. The flight attendants came, the ground controllers who'd guided them in, even Captain Brennan, who'd recovered from his heart attack and had just retired with full honors. Avery gave a speech about how the accident had exposed failures in their systems and how they'd worked to fix them. She talked about the new hiring practices, the support programs, the cultural shift toward acknowledging that pilots were human beings with human struggles. She talked about Owen, though he'd asked her not to, describing how his courage had not just saved lives that night, but had sparked changes throughout the industry. Then she invited Owen to speak, and he walked to the front of the room with his heart pounding, but his voice steady. He looked out at 300 people who'd been strangers and were now connected by shared survival, and he told them the truth. "I'm not a hero," he began, and immediately several people started to object. He held up his hand. "Please, let me finish. I'm not a hero because I didn't do anything that night that any qualified pilot wouldn't have done. What I am is lucky. Lucky that I was on that plane. Lucky that Sarah was skilled enough to keep us in the air until I got to the cockpit. Lucky that the aircraft held together long enough for us to land it. Lucky that every one of you survived." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I'm also proof that the system was broken. I'd applied to work for Meridian multiple times and been rejected automatically because of gaps in my resume and medical history related to PTSD. The very person who ended up saving this flight was someone the system had already decided wasn't worth a second look. That should terrify all of us. How many other qualified pilots are out there, sidelined by trauma or circumstance, their skills and experience wasted because they don't fit a perfect profile?" The room was completely silent now, everyone listening. "Over the past year, we've made changes. Real changes. Every application now gets human review. Veterans are evaluated by people who understand military service. Mental health support is confidential and encouraged rather than punished. We're creating pathways back into aviation for people who've been pushed out. But this is just one company, one small corner of the industry. We need these changes everywhere.
We need every airline, every aviation company to understand that protecting pilot mental health isn't just morally right, it's essential for safety. Owen looked at Ethan sitting in the front row next to Avery. His son gave him a thumbs up, completely unself-conscious. The night of the crash, my 6-year-old son asked me if we were going to die. And in that moment, I had to choose between my fear and his life. I chose his life. I got up and went to that cockpit even though everything in me screamed to stay put. That's not heroism. That's just being a parent. But it taught me something important. We're all capable of more than we think. We're all stronger than our fears. And sometimes the scariest thing we can do is also the most necessary. He finished his speech to standing applause. But what mattered more was the conversations afterward. Passengers thanking him, yes, but also sharing their own stories. The woman who'd been bleeding from a head wound telling him she'd gone back to school at 50 to finally get her degree. The teenage boy, now a year older, explaining how the crash had made him want to become an EMT. The elderly couple who'd held hands during the landing, saying they'd renewed their vows on their 60th anniversary because they'd been given a second chance at life. People who'd faced death and chosen to live differently because of it. That was the real legacy of Flight 447. Not just that they'd survived, but that survival had meant something. Late in the evening, as the event was winding down, Owen found himself on the hotel balcony with Avery. The Seattle skyline glittered in the darkness, aircraft lights moving across the sky in their predictable patterns, everything ordered and safe. "You did good work in there," Avery said, sipping wine. "Good speech." "I meant every word." "I know, that's why it worked." She turned to look at him. "I've been thinking about succession planning. I know that sounds strange since I'm only 43, but the board wants contingencies in place. They're asking me to identify potential future leadership for the company." Owen had no idea where she was going with this. "Okay. I'm recommending you. Not immediately, not for years probably, but you have something most executives never develop. You understand both the operational and human sides of this business. You know what it takes to actually do the job, and you care about the people doing it. That's rare." "Avery, I've been in corporate aviation for less than a year. I can't, not today, but someday." She smiled. "Just think about it. Think about what kind of leader you want to be, what kind of company you want to help build. You've already changed more in 1 year than most people change in a career. Imagine what you could do with actual authority." Owen let that sit. The idea of running an aviation company, of being responsible for thousands of employees and millions of passengers should have terrified him. Maybe it did, but it also felt possible in a way that nothing had felt possible a year ago. 3 months later, on a cold January evening, Owen took Ethan to the cemetery where Jake was buried. It was the first time Owen had visited since the funeral 5 years ago, the weight of guilt and grief having kept him away. But he'd been working through all of that in therapy, understanding that Jake's death wasn't his fault, that carrying that guilt didn't honor his friend's memory. They stood at the grave, a simple military headstone with Jake's name and rank, and dates that said he'd only lived 29 years. Ethan held Mr. Trunks and stayed quiet, understanding somehow that this was important. "Hey, Jake," Owen said, his voice rough. "Sorry it took me so long to visit. I've been working through some things. But I wanted you to meet my son. Ethan, this is Jake. He was my co-pilot and my best friend. He would have loved you." "Hi, Mr. Jake," Ethan said solemnly. "My dad says you were really brave." He was, the bravest person I ever knew. Owen crouched down, putting his arm around Ethan. "I also wanted to tell you that I'm flying again. I know you'd be making fun of me for taking 5 years to get back in a cockpit. I can hear you in my head calling me names, challenging me to races we both know you'd win." His voice cracked. "I miss you every day, but I'm not letting missing you stop me from living anymore. I hope that's okay." The wind moved through the trees, cold and clean, and Owen felt something release that he'd been holding for 5 years. Permission, maybe. Or forgiveness. Or just the understanding that Jake would have wanted him to move forward, would have been the first person pushing him back into the sky. They stayed for a few more minutes, Owen telling Jake about the crash and the landing and the job and all the ways his life had changed. Then they walked back to the car, Ethan's small hand in Owen's larger one, both of them quiet but not sad. Are you okay, Dad? Ethan asked as Owen started the car. Yeah, buddy, I think I finally am. 2 years after the crash, on a crisp December morning, Owen stood on the observation deck at SeaTac Airport watching aircraft take off and land with the rhythmic precision of a well-ordered system. He was in uniform now, captain's stripes on his shoulders, his path from mechanic to director to line pilot to captain completed in an unconventional trajectory that had raised some eyebrows but ultimately proven itself through performance. Sarah stood beside him, also in uniform, about to start her own captain upgrade training. They'd flown together dozens of times over the past 2 years, their partnership easy and natural, built on mutual respect and shared trauma, transformed into shared strength. You ready for today? Sarah asked. As ready as I'll ever be. Today was significant. Today Owen was taking command of a flight for the first time as a fully qualified captain. Not just any flight, Flight 447, the same route that had nearly killed them all 2 years ago. Meridian had retired the old aircraft number for 6 months before bringing it back at Owen's suggestion. Numbers were just numbers. The route needed to be flown. Better to reclaim it than let fear own it forever. The flight boarded normally, passengers settling in with their phones and books and coffee, most of them completely unaware of the significance of the flight number or the pilot in the left seat. Owen did his pre-flight walk-around with the careful attention he'd learned in the military and relearned in the aftermath of trauma. He checked every surface, every panel, every component. Not because he didn't trust the mechanics, he'd been one, he knew they were thorough, but because checking was ritual and ritual was comfort. Ethan and Avery were in first class, a surprise Owen hadn't known about until he'd checked the manifest. He stopped by their seats during boarding, raising an eyebrow at Avery. Moral support, she said simply. Plus, I need to get to a conference in Los Angeles anyway. Might as well fly with someone I trust. Can I see the cockpit? Ethan asked, practically bouncing in his seat. He was 8 now, all gangly limbs and missing teeth and boundless enthusiasm. After we land, Owen promised. Can't have you distracting me up there. Are you nervous? Ethan asked with the directness of children who haven't learned to soften their questions. Owen considered lying, giving some confident pilot speech about how routine this was. But Ethan deserved honesty. A little, but nervous is okay. It means I care about doing a good job. He returned to the cockpit where Sarah, flying as his first officer today in a reversal of their roles from that night, was finishing her checks. They worked through the checklist together, their communication efficient and comfortable, a crew that trusted each other completely. How you feeling? Sarah asked as they waited for pushback clearance. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The flight was routine in the best way. They climbed into clear skies, the weather cooperating completely unlike 2 years ago. Owen handled the controls with a confidence that had taken hundreds of hours and countless therapy sessions to rebuild. He wasn't the same pilot he'd been before Jake died. That man was gone forever. But he was something better, someone who'd been broken and had learned how to heal, who understood that strength included vulnerability and courage included fear. They landed in Los Angeles 3 hours later, a textbook approach and touchdown. Sarah calling out altitudes and airspeeds, while Owen flew with the easy precision of someone who'd finally made peace with the sky. The passengers applauded, the way passengers do sometimes, not knowing they were celebrating something larger than a smooth landing. After shutdown, Owen kept his promise and brought Ethan into the cockpit. His son sat in the captain's seat, too small for it still, but his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at all the instruments and controls. Is it hard? Ethan asked. Flying. Sometimes, but worth it. Owen ruffled his son's hair. Anything worth doing is usually hard. I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up. Owen felt his throat tighten. You can be anything you want, buddy. Pilot, paleontologist, astronaut, whatever makes you happy. Just promise me you'll be brave enough to try even when it's scary. I promise. That evening, after they'd checked into their hotel and Ethan had fallen asleep, Owen stood on the balcony looking at the Los Angeles lights and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The crash that had forced him to face his fears, the job offer that had given him purpose, the slow, painful work of therapy and healing, the countless small decisions to try again, to risk failure, to believe he could be more than his trauma. His phone buzzed with a message from Avery. Proud of you. That was a perfect flight. He typed back, "Thanks for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Her response came immediately. "That's what friends do. Friends." Owen smiled at that. A year ago, he'd had no one but Ethan. Now he had Sarah and Avery and David and Marcus and Jennifer and dozens of other people at Meridian who'd become something like family. Community built from shared purpose and mutual support. People who understood that everyone was fighting some kind of battle and that helping each other through those battles made everyone stronger. The changes they'd implemented at Meridian had spread throughout the industry over the past 2 years. Other airlines had started reviewing their hiring practices, creating veteran support programs, acknowledging that pilot mental health mattered. It wasn't perfect. The industry still had a long way to go, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress that was already making a difference in pilots' lives. Owen's integration department had grown to 15 people, handling not just hiring but ongoing support for pilots throughout their careers. They'd created mentorship programs pairing experienced pilots with newer ones, established confidential counseling services that pilots actually used, developed training for managers on recognizing and responding to mental health concerns. The work was endless but fulfilling in ways Owen had never experienced before. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, he'd started flying again. Not because he had to, not to prove anything to anyone, but because he'd rediscovered his love for it. The sky wasn't his enemy anymore. It was just sky. Beautiful and challenging and occasionally terrifying, but ultimately just another place where he could do work that mattered. 6 months later, on the 3rd anniversary of the crash, Meridian dedicated a training room in Owen's name, the Owen Parker Pilot Support Center, where pilots could access counseling, attend support groups, get help with FAA medical certifications, or just talk to someone who understood the pressures they faced. Owen attended the dedication ceremony with Ethan and Sarah and Avery, all of them standing in front of a plaque that read, "In honor of those who have the courage to ask for help and the wisdom to offer it." "I can't believe you named a room after me," Owen said to Avery afterward. "I'm not dead. Rooms get named after you when you're dead. Or when you change an entire industry's approach to pilot mental health in less than 3 years." Avery smiled. "Deal with it. You're a legend whether you like it or not." "I'm really not comfortable with that." "I know. That's part of why it's true." Standing in that room with its comfortable chairs and resources and the promise of support for pilots who needed it, Owen thought about the night of the crash, about the man he'd been then, broken, terrified, convinced he had nothing left to offer the world. If someone had told that man he'd be here 3 years later, he wouldn't have believed it, would have thought it was impossible. But impossible just meant nobody had done it yet. Owen looked at Ethan, who was exploring the room with Sarah, asking her technical questions about flying that she answered with patient detail. His son was healthy and happy and secure in ways Owen had barely managed to provide before. Ethan had friends and hobbies and a future that looked bright instead of precarious. That alone made everything worth it. "Thank you," Owen said to Avery, not for the first time and probably not for the last. "For taking a chance on me, for seeing past the resume to the person, for giving me the opportunity to do this work. You earned it, every bit of it." Avery's expression was serious now. "But I should thank you too. You reminded me why we do this work, why aviation matters. It's not about the money or the metrics or the corporate success. It's about getting people safely from one place to another and taking care of the professionals who make that possible. I'd lost sight of that until you sat down next to me on that plane." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Ethan and Sarah, listening to the sounds of the building around them, the hum of HVAC, distant conversations, the mechanical rhythm of an office functioning. Normal sounds, safe sounds, the sounds of a life rebuilt from wreckage. That night, Owen tucked Ethan into bed and sat with him while his son fought sleep the way he always did, asking questions and telling stories and generally delaying the inevitable. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was sleepy. "Are you happy?" "Yeah, buddy, I really am." "Good. You smile more now. I like it when you smile." Owen kissed his son's forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door cracked the way Ethan preferred. He went to his own room and looked at the photo on his nightstand, the one from his Air Force days, Him and Jake in their flight suits standing in front of a C-130, both of them young and whole and laughing at something long forgotten. "I hope you'd be proud," Owen whispered to the photo. "I hope you think I did okay." He could almost hear Jake's response, that distinctive laugh, and the ribbing that would follow. Jake would absolutely give him grief about taking 5 years to get back in a cockpit, would make jokes about Owen getting soft, would challenge him to prove he could still fly. But underneath the jokes would be pride, would be the understanding that Owen had found his way through the darkness and come out the other side still capable of caring, still capable of helping others, still capable of being the kind of pilot and person that Jake had always believed he could be. The sky outside his window was clear, stars visible despite the city lights, each one a distant sun supporting worlds Owen would never see. But his world was here. Was Ethan sleeping down the hall, and Sarah's friendship, and Avery's mentorship, and the work that gave his days meaning. His world was the pilots he helped, and the systems he changed, and the knowledge that his trauma, as terrible as it had led to something valuable. Owen Parker had been a pilot who couldn't fly, a mechanic living in the shadows of what he'd lost. Then chance had put him on a failing aircraft next to a CEO who saw past his resume to his potential. And in the 3 hours it took to bring that aircraft down safely, he'd found a way back to himself. Not the self he'd been before Jake died. That person was gone forever, left behind in the smoke and fire of a training mission gone wrong. But a new self, forged in the crucible of fear, overcome and trust rebuilt. Someone who understood that strength came not from never falling, but from getting back up. Someone who knew that the measure of a life wasn't in its uninterrupted success, but in how you responded when everything fell apart. He was a father, a pilot, a director, a friend. He was someone who'd faced his demons and found them beatable. He was someone who'd been given a second chance and was determined to make it count. He was Owen Parker, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story that began with an accidental moment, a CEO sleeping on a stranger's shoulder, a pilot forced back into a cockpit he'd sworn never to enter, had become something neither of them could have predicted. It had exposed broken systems and catalyzed real change. It had saved 300 lives in the moment and countless more through the ripples that spread outward from that night. It had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up, even when giving up seems like the only rational choice. And it had reminded everyone involved that in the end, aviation wasn't about aircraft or algorithms or corporate efficiency. It was about people. Vulnerable, flawed, courageous people, trusting each other with their lives and doing everything possible to honor that trust. That was the real story of Flight 447. Not a dramatic rescue or a feel-good tale of heroism, but a reminder that we're all broken in different ways and we're all capable of more than we think. That the systems we build to keep us safe can sometimes be what puts us in danger. That the people we overlook might be exactly the people we need most. And that sometimes the highest form of courage is simply showing up when everything in you screams to run away. Owen had shown up that night, and in doing so, he'd saved more than just a plane full of passengers. He'd saved himself. The end.